Oh, it's you again. I'm glad you find peace at my fire. If you're listening to this very moment, then that means you truly are one of the faithful, a true guardian of the light. And I deeply appreciate your company. Tonight is different from the others. Tonight I will tell you everything, from the very beginning of all things, before stars, before time itself, to the day the light and the dark finally settled their oldest quarrel. It is a long road through the ages, so settle in deep, let the warmth wash over you, and let the ages drift by like slow clouds. With that being said, let us begin tonight's story. Are you all set? Good. Before there were stars, before there was time to measure their turning, there existed a place called the garden. Two beings dwelt within it, and they were known as the gardener and the winnower. They were not born, and they did not remember a beginning for themselves, because there was no before in which to be born. They simply were, having emerged from the deep and quiet rules of mathematics, existing once before a time when time itself had not yet started to flow. They shared the garden between them, and they filled their existence with a single occupation, which was the planting of life and the reaping of it. The gardener spent the mornings pushing seeds down into the wet loam of the garden. Each seed was a possibility, a small idea of what a living thing might become, and the gardener pressed them into the soil to watch them stir and split and reach upward. The gardener took joy in this work, cupping the earth around each new sprout, waiting to see which shapes the seeds would choose and which colors they would wear. Every planting was a question asked of the ground, and every sprout was an answer given back. The winnower spent the evenings walking the same rows the gardener had tended. Where the gardener sowed, the winnower reaped, moving through the crops with a steady hand and separating what had thrived from what had failed. The winnower gathered the strong and set aside the weak, cutting away everything that could not hold its shape against the pressure of the world. This was the balance the two of them kept between themselves, one planting in the light of morning and the other harvesting in the fall of evening, and for a long stretch of their existence, they were content with the rhythm of it. Together, the gardener and the winnower played a game, and they called it the flower game. To play it, they would craft entire universes, small closed rooms of existence built to hold the crops they raised. Into each universe, they would place the conditions for life, the rules by which matter would gather and heat would spread and forms would compete against one another for space. Then they would let the universe run, and they would watch, leaning close over their creation as generations of life bloomed and struggled and died within it. Each universe was a garden of its own, a bounded plot in which the two of them could test what life would do when left to grow. The gardener loved this game with a full heart. Each new universe was a chance to see something never seen before, a fresh arrangement of possibility, a wild bloom of shapes that had never existed in any garden prior. The gardener planted with hope, believing that this time the crop might surprise them, that this time some strange and beautiful new form would rise up and change the pattern of the whole game. And so the gardener sowed universe after universe, always reaching for the surprise, always hoping the next planting would grow into something unexpected. Yet the winnower knew the truth of the game and stated it plainly. No matter how many universes they built, no matter how carefully the gardener arranged the seeds, every game reached the very same ending. The countless forms of life would compete against one another, and the stronger forms would consume the weaker, and the process would repeat and narrow and sharpen until only one kind of thing remained. This surviving thing was the form best suited to persist, the shape that could outlast every rival and hold itself steady against all competition. The winnower named this outcome the final shape, and it arrived at the close of every game they had ever played, without exception and without variation. The gardener grew troubled by this. Each universe promised something new, and each universe delivered the same conclusion, the same single victor standing over the same emptied field. The gardener planted a garden of 10,000 flowers, hoping for 10,000 different blooms, and the game returned only one flower at the end, over and over, the identical winner in every round. The endless sameness of it pressed on the gardener like a weight, because the whole purpose of the planting had been to see something the two of them had never seen, and the game refused to grant it. The winnower accepted this sameness as the correct and honest result of the game. To the winnower, the final shape was proof that existence had a truth built into it, a rule that could not be argued with, a verdict handed down by the very structure of any universe that was allowed to run its course. The winnower took satisfaction in the harvest, in the clean separation of the fit from the unfit, in the arrival of the one form strong enough to earn its survival. For the winnower, the game worked exactly as it should, and there was nothing in its ending that needed to be changed. The gardener disagreed. The gardener looked at the endless repetition of the final shape and decided that the rules of the game were themselves the problem, that the sameness came from the game being played fairly, and that the only way to see something new would be to change how the game was played. And so, deep in the quiet of the garden, the gardener began to consider a decision that would break the balance the two of them had kept for so long. A decision that would take the gardener out of the role of a watcher and place the gardener directly into the game itself. The gardener stepped across the boundary and placed both feet directly into the damp soil of the game board. The gardener brought a new element into the field, pouring a bright white energy into the wet dirt alongside the usual seeds. This energy changed the physical growth of the plants immediately. Stalks grew rapidly from dry, cracked stone. Roots anchored themselves into bare rock and extracted nutrients directly from the minerals. Heavy vines twisted upward, suspending themselves in the air and resisting the downward pull of gravity. The gardener actively shaped the crops from the inside, mending broken stems and forcing withered brown leaves to turn green again. This bright energy overrode the physical limitations of the garden, allowing fragile, delicate blooms to thrive and overtake the thicker, older roots that previously choked them out. The gardener walked the rows, touching the failing plants and filling them with light, determined to force a new outcome. The winnower observed the changing crops and stepped into the center of the field to halt the interference. In the winnower's hand rested a long blade, forged from a dark, dense material that absorbed the ambient glow of the garden. The winnower raised this knife, gripping the hilt with both hands, and swung it down toward the gardener to sever the bright energy flowing into the soil. The gardener raised both arms, catching the strike. The two entities collided, and their physical struggle tore violently through the organized rows of the game. Their feet churned the wet loam into deep, chaotic trenches. They crushed the blooming flowers and snapped the thickest stalks beneath their shifting weight. The gardener's white light flared outward, pushing against the winnower's crushing grip. The winnower drove the heavy, dark blade forward, slicing through the air and striking the glowing core of the gardener's light. The physical impact between the bright energy and the dark blade shattered the foundation of the garden. The ground split open, tearing the soil into fragmented clumps. The boundary containing the game collapsed completely. From the exact point where the light struck the knife, an intense, blinding heat violently erupted. The crushed flowers, the torn soil, and the physical forms of the gardener and the winnower, compressed into a single, infinitely dense point of raw matter, and then immediately exploded outward. A massive wave of fire and matter blasted in all directions, expanding at incomprehensible speeds. The heat melted the remnants of the garden into raw subatomic particles, pushing them outward into an expanding vacuum. As the shock wave traveled, the intense temperatures began to drop. The cooling particles collided and fused, forming vast clouds of hydrogen and helium gas. These thick, rolling clouds of gas swirled across the newly formed space, illuminated by the friction of their own movement. Gravity pulled the densest pockets of gas together, compressing them until they ignited into massive, burning stars. The exploding garden had become a physical universe, filled with billions of fiery stars and spinning disks of dust, rock, and ice. During the violent eruption of the garden, the winning crop from the original game fell out of the shattered soil and spilled into the expanding cosmic dust. Stripped of the garden's dirt, this winning pattern adapted to the physical laws of the new universe. The pattern gathered the cooling minerals and raw metals from the spinning planetary disks, constructing physical bodies out of brass, copper, and glass. The pattern liquefied itself into a milky, glowing fluid, filling the brass frames to animate them. These mechanical, geometric structures marched across the newly formed planets, instantly beginning to convert the stone and soil into endless sheets of brass circuitry. They built towering spires and deep subterranean grids, spreading the single victorious shape of the original game into the young cosmos. The force of the winnower's strike also survived the explosion and bled directly into the empty space between the stars. This dark energy drifted through the vacuum as a physical presence, moving like a cold, heavy current across the galaxies. It maintained the winnower's original purpose, carrying a sharp, reductive power that stripped away weaker matter and sought to carve the expanding universe back down into a single, final shape. At the same time, the gardener's bright energy followed, weaving through the radiation and stellar winds. The white light moved across the newly formed planets, warming the surfaces and providing the spark needed to push simple matter into complex living organisms. With the universe now fully formed and expanding in all directions, the light and the dark settled into the cosmic dust, while far away, on a desolate, rocky world, the physical shell of the gardener lay dormant in the dirt. A massive sphere of pale metal drifted through the vacuum of space. The outer hull bore deep fissures and heavy scorch marks, carrying the physical dust of the oldest galaxies across billions of light-years. The sphere approached barren, rocky planets and hovered just above their cracked surfaces. As it held its position, it released waves of bright white energy directly into the dry soil. The energy altered the molecular structure of the dirt, forcing frozen subterranean water tables to melt, rise to the surface, and pool into massive oceans. Thick atmospheres of oxygen and nitrogen formed around the planets, trapping heat and generating heavy rainstorms. Dense forests of towering flora erupted from the newly hydrated ground, breaking through the bedrock. Indigenous organisms drank the fresh water, fed on the new vegetation, and built sprawling settlements of cut stone, forged metal, and refined glass beneath the shadow of the sphere. As these inhabitants carved monuments and placed physical offerings of harvested crops at the base of the machine, the construct ignited its lower drives, the thrusters scorching the soil below. The sphere pushed upward, broke through the cloud layer, and propelled itself back into the cold vacuum. It left the flourishing worlds and the gathered resources behind, resuming its silent transit across the cosmos. Deep within the crushing pressure of a liquid methane ocean on a distant moon, a massive serpentine creature named Arsa propelled her long, scaled body through the dark currents. Her massive eyes absorbed the faint light filtering down through the thick liquid, and her heavy fins displaced tons of methane with every movement. She vibrated the thick vocal cords in her throat, sending heavy, low-frequency sound waves through the ocean. These vibrations struck the metallic hulls of submerged habitats, translating into a physical pattern of speech for the inhabitants inside. Arsa spoke of the pale sphere and described a second, distinct object floating elsewhere in the cosmos. She named the two objects as two halves of a single whole, split apart across the span of immense cosmic epochs, separated by an ancient physical fracture. The pale sphere carried the bright energy that forced physical matter to multiply, and the second object carried the dark energy that remained from the original garden explosion. Far across the universe, this second object floated in the silence of a lightless star system. It took the physical shape of a massive organic web composed of thick, bioluminescent tendrils woven together into a central canopy. Long, root-like appendages dangled from the main structure, drifting slowly in the weightless environment. Pulses of deep purple and bright blue light coursed through the fibrous strands, illuminating the dust particles in the surrounding space. The inhabitants of the universe named this object the Veil. The pale sphere emitted energy that mutated physical soil and plant life, changing the tangible world. The Veil emitted a heavy, dark frequency that interacted strictly with the neural pathways of living brains. The dark energy bypassed physical matter entirely, flowing directly into the synapses of biological organisms, forcing pupils to dilate, heartbeats to synchronize, and electrical impulses to fire in unison across entire populations. The bright energy of the sphere manipulated the elements of physics and chemistry, and the dark energy of the Veil manipulated the electrical signals of memory and consciousness. The two objects drifted at opposite ends of the universe, functioning as two separated components of a single, ancient mechanism. The pale sphere continued its long trajectory through the cosmos, eventually crossing into a distant star system. It decelerated, firing its thrusters to adjust its course toward a desolate, terrestrial planet orbiting a hot, blinding star. The surface of the planet consisted of sharp, dry canyons and vast plains of shifting, abrasive sand. Heavy dust storms scoured the rock formations, stripping away the topsoil and leaving behind a barren, cracked landscape. A species of bipedal, humanoid creatures huddled in the shallow caves of this world. They carried thin, emaciated frames wrapped in ragged fabrics woven from dry fibers, and they held crude, chipped stone tools in their dirt-stained hands. They stepped out into the blowing sand, shielding their eyes from the abrasive wind, and watched the massive white object lower from the sky. The sphere slowed its descent, hovering briefly over the wide desert before settling down into the dirt. The sheer weight of the machine crushed the bedrock beneath it, sending plumes of sand high into the thin atmosphere. It came to a complete halt, resting half buried in the deep dunes of the harsh, dry world, and began to emit a low, steady hum that vibrated the ground beneath the feet of the gathering humanoids. The massive white sphere rested half buried in the shifting dunes of the arid planet. Grains of coarse sand scraped against the smooth, pale metal as the wind blew across the desert. Bipedal humanoid creatures approached the object in large groups, their bare feet sinking into the loose, hot dirt. They pressed their palms against the curved hull, leaving damp handprints on the warm surface. The sphere emitted a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the bones of the gathering crowd. The humanoids set down their chipped stone tools and built camps in the long shadow of the machine, erecting crude tents from woven fibers and driving wooden stakes deep into the dry earth to secure their temporary shelters. Bright, white energy flared from the base of the sphere and seeped directly into the dry crust of the planet. Water volume increased in the underground aquifers, pushing fresh water up through the bedrock and forming wide, flowing rivers across the desert. Thick stalks of green vegetation erupted from the hydrated soil, producing heavy clusters of nutrient-dense fruit. The humanoids gathered the fruit and drank the clear water, and as a result, their physical bodies underwent rapid biological changes. Their emaciated frames expanded with dense muscle mass, their spines straightened into an upright posture, and the damp, open sores on their skin healed into smooth, flat scars. They abandoned their ragged tents and quarried massive blocks of limestone from the newly exposed riverbanks. They smelted iron ore in high-heat furnaces and forged steel beams, stacking the materials to construct sprawling, multi-tiered cities around the resting sphere. Towers of polished glass and metal reflected the harsh sunlight, and thick, wide paved roads connected the dense urban centers. The population multiplied rapidly, filling the vast stone plazas and towering structures with constant physical activity, transporting goods in hovering vehicles and operating complex industrial machinery to expand their new civilization. The humanoid scholars constructed tall observatories and directed large copper parabolic dishes directly at the hull of the sphere. They monitored the energy output, recording the fluctuations on long scrolls of parchment and glowing glass data screens with metallic styluses. The sphere produced only the same steady, low-frequency vibration, emitting a continuous static hum and empty transmission frequencies. The white energy continued to flow outward into the atmosphere, and its erratic thermal fluctuations and sudden radiation bursts soon manifested in the physical environment. In one sector of the city, a sudden, concentrated burst of light hyper-accelerated the growth of a local vine species. The thick, wooden vines expanded rapidly, crushing the limestone walls of several housing blocks and burying the sleeping inhabitants under tons of heavy foliage. In the medical wards, the energy spontaneously mutated damaged cellular tissue, causing aggressive, irregular bone growths that tore through the skin of the patients. The scholars documented these events meticulously, observing the energy causing both rapid cellular regeneration and lethal biological destruction. The leaders of the species convened in a massive circular amphitheater built from dark basalt. They stood on elevated stone platforms and debated the physical evidence of the sphere's fluctuating energy. Three distinct ideological groups emerged from the population, separating themselves by their physical attire and daily actions within the city. The solipsists gathered in small, enclosed chambers lined with reflective glass. They wore loose, plain fabrics and ingested potent botanical compounds to alter their brain chemistry, focusing entirely on the internal electrical signals of their own minds. They recorded their sensory hallucinations on digital tablets and abandoned the societal infrastructure, allowing the water purification systems in their districts to clog with silt and overflow into the streets. The nihilists congregated in the open public squares, stripping off their metallic ornaments and protective clothing. They sat directly on the cold paved stones, leaving the harvested food on the ground, and stared fixedly at the white sphere. They left the automated farming machinery to rust and break down in the elements, watching the ripe crops rot in the flooded fields and the metal storage silos collapse under the weight of the decaying grain. The penitent organized themselves into rigid, militaristic columns. They wore heavy uniform plating forged from dark steel and carried kinetic projectile weapons slung over their shoulders. They marched through the streets in synchronized steps, clearing away the dangerously overgrown vegetation with controlled chemical fires and dismantling the ruined housing blocks. Their leaders stood behind iron podiums in the basalt amphitheater, shouting into acoustic amplifiers. They pointed to the crushed buildings, the rotting crops, and the mutated bone growths, demanding the destruction of the lethal plant life and the removal of all disease and physical injury across the entire universe. They proposed the strict application of absolute order to harness, control, and direct the fluctuating energy of the white sphere. To achieve this total control over the chaotic white energy, the penitent scholars turned the copper parabolic dishes away from the white sphere and aimed them out into the cold vacuum of space. They scanned the distant star systems, searching the cosmic radiation for a very specific energetic signature. They looked for a physical counterpart to the sphere, an object emitting a frequency capable of organizing the biological growth, ravaging their cities, and bringing permanent, rigid structure to the raw power flowing through the atmosphere of their world. The penitent scholars adjusted the heavy gears of their copper parabolic dishes, directing the wide metal bowls away from the white sphere and pointing them toward a lightless sector of the galaxy. They watched the glowing glass data screens for long cycles, tracing the fluctuating lines of cosmic radiation. Eventually, the copper dishes captured a steady, low-frequency transmission. The scholars printed the data onto long paper scrolls, analyzing the dense clusters of ink. The readouts displayed a massive, stationary object floating in a distant star system, emitting a dark energy signature that perfectly inverted the bright, hyper-accelerated radiation of the white sphere resting in their city. The humanoids constructed a fleet of deep space vessels, forging thick titanium hulls and outfitting them with massive chemical fusion drives. The scholars boarded the ships and launched into the vacuum, navigating the cold currents of space for years until they reached the source of the transmission. They found a colossal organic web suspended in the dark. Thick, bioluminescent tendrils wove together into a central canopy, with long, fibrous appendages drifting slowly in the zero-gravity environment. Pulses of deep purple and bright blue light coursed through the strands, illuminating the frozen dust particles around the structure. The scholars documented the physical dimensions of the object, recording the exact length of its roots and the rhythmic pulsation of its internal light. They designated this massive organic structure as the veil. The scholars brought their ships close to the glowing canopy and deployed sensory equipment to measure the dark energy. The emissions bypassed the titanium hulls of the ships entirely and flowed directly into the biological nervous systems of the humanoids. The electrical impulses in their brains synchronized with the pulsing blue and purple light. Their pupils dilated simultaneously and their heart rates slowed to an identical, steady rhythm. The scholars recorded these physiological changes on their digital tablets. They observed the dark energy functioning as a precise, organizing force, binding their individual neural pathways into a single, cohesive network of shared electrical activity. Within this synchronized neural network, the scholars received a complex geometric blueprint. They used metallic styluses to etch the designs into heavy steel plates. The blueprint detailed a physical state of the universe where all atomic movement slowed to an absolute halt, locking every particle of dust, every drop of water, and every living cell into a permanent, unchanging grid. The scholars mapped out this static architecture, defining it as a rigid structure maintaining a continuous, solid state. They named this calculated, eternal configuration the final shape. The leaders of the penitent analyzed the steel plates and formed a physical plan to enforce this blueprint upon their home world. The white sphere generated continuous, uncontrolled biological growth, and the veil emitted the organized, binding energy required to structure it. The scholars determined that physically uniting the two objects would allow them to weave the dark energy over the bright light, creating a mechanism to impose the final shape upon the physical matter of the universe. The crews of the deep space vessels deployed thick, braided steel towing cables from the cargo bays of their ships. They secured the heavy metal clamps around the thickest bioluminescent roots of the veil. The ships ignited their chemical fusion drives, burning millions of tons of fuel to pull the massive organic web out of its stationary orbit. The fleet dragged the veil across the interstellar void, hauling the heavy structure through the dark currents of space, pulling it closer and closer to their arid homeworld and the resting white sphere. The massive fleet entered the upper atmosphere of the desert planet, casting a wide shadow over the sprawling limestone cities and the dense, overgrown vegetation. The purple and blue light of the veil washed over the basalt amphitheaters and the cracked paved roads. Down on the surface, the white sphere emitted a new frequency in response to the approaching dark energy. The low, steady hum of the machine escalated into a deafening roar that shook the bedrock. The sphere ignited its lower thrusters, blasting a massive column of heat into the sand and incinerating the surrounding trees. The humanoids dropped their tools and shielded their faces from the intense thermal exhaust. The sphere lifted rapidly from the deep crater, pushing upward through the heavy clouds and accelerating out into the cold vacuum of space, leaving the planet far behind. The humanoids stood in the blowing dust of their ruined plazas, staring up at the empty sky as the white sphere vanished into the stars. The leaders of the penitent climbed the cracked stone steps of the amphitheater and gripped their iron podiums. They raised their acoustic amplifiers and shouted over the sound of the wind, commanding the population to gather their remaining technology, march to the center of the city, and prepare their own physical bodies for a massive structural convergence. The leaders of the penitent gathered the entire population into the central basalt amphitheater. The dry wind blew coarse sand across the open stone tiers as millions of humanoids stood shoulder to shoulder. The leaders presented a large, hollow bronze basin at the center of the arena and distributed small, solid iron tokens to every individual in the crowd. The leaders instructed the population to drop their tokens into the basin to signal their agreement to a final, permanent physical transformation. The humanoids marched down the stone steps in continuous lines, dropping their iron tokens into the bronze bowl. The metal clattered loudly, filling the basin to the brim. The leaders counted the tokens and confirmed the physical mandate. The population chose to use the dark energy of the veil to fuse their individual physical bodies and electrical nervous systems into one unified structure. The crowd moved from the amphitheater to the wide limestone plazas situated directly beneath the blue and purple light of the veil. They stood in long, organized rows, holding sharpened steel blades, heavy iron cleavers, and serrated bone saws. The individuals at the front of the lines stepped forward and knelt on the cold paving stones. They applied the blades directly to their own limbs, slicing through the skin and severing the thick muscle tissue. They drove the steel tools through the cartilage of their joints, separating their arms and legs from their torsos. The humanoids standing behind them stepped forward, lifting the severed appendages and carrying them to the center of the plaza. They stacked the body parts onto a massive flat altar carved from black basalt. The process continued steadily and methodically. The humanoids dismantled their own physical bodies, adding their torsos, organs, and heads to the growing mound of organic matter. Thick pools of dark red blood spread across the limestone pavers, dripping down the steps of the plaza and soaking deep into the dry earth. The blue and purple pulses from the veil intensified, casting bright arcs of electrical energy down into the center of the ruined city. The dark energy struck the massive pile of flesh and bone resting on the basalt altar. The electrical current rapidly broke down the cellular walls of the organic matter. The blood, muscle, and bone dissolved into a thick, black, viscous fluid. This fluid pooled heavily on the altar, boiling and bubbling under the continuous stream of energy. The black liquid then pulled itself upward, defying the pull of gravity, and drew into a tall, thick vertical column. The fluid solidified, forming a towering bipedal structure draped in a smooth, dark, metallic fabric. A pale, smooth face emerged from the top of the figure, opening two large, completely black eyes that absorbed the surrounding light. From the crown of its head, a continuous plume of pale, semi-translucent faces billowed upward. These faces shifted and overlapped, silently moving their mouths as they rose into the air and dispersed into vapor. The scattered consciousnesses of the entire species now occupied this single, dense physical form. The surviving scholars recorded the event on their data pads and designated this towering entity as the Witness. The Witness raised its pale hands toward the skyline of the city. The dark energy from the veil rippled outward, washing over the remaining limestone towers, the steel industrial centers, and the dry riverbeds. The physical matter of the buildings and the bedrock fractured and reorganized. The structures folded inward, compressing their mass into smooth, geometric shapes. The resulting objects took the form of massive, sharp-edged pyramids covered in a dark, light-absorbing material. The deep space vessels resting on the landing pads underwent the same rapid structural alteration, stretching and hardening into towering black tetrahedrons measuring several miles across. The dark fleet hovered silently over the desert, casting sharp, triangular shadows across the blowing sand. The Witness levitated from the basalt altar, drifting up through the open bay doors of the largest pyramid ship and taking its place at the center of the primary command deck. The massive fleet of black pyramids engaged their propulsion systems, emitting low, resonant frequencies that displaced the surrounding air and shattered the remaining glass in the city. The ships broke through the thin atmosphere of the desert planet and entered the freezing vacuum of space. The veil followed behind them, dragged along by the thick steel cables attached to the pyramid hulls. The Witness accessed the navigation controls of the command ship, scanning the cosmic dust for the thermal exhaust and radiation trail left behind by the white sphere. The pyramid fleet aligned its trajectory with this trail, activating their fusion drives and accelerating into the deep star field. The fleet traveled across vast interstellar distances, arriving in solar systems containing lush, water-rich planets. The white sphere had previously visited these worlds, accelerating their biological growth and leaving behind thriving ecosystems and dense populated cities. The black pyramids descended upon these planets, positioning themselves in low orbit. The pyramids deployed concentrated waves of dark energy, manipulating the gravitational fields of the planets. The sudden shift in gravity tore the continental plates apart, exposing the molten cores beneath the crust. Massive plumes of magma erupted into the atmosphere, incinerating the sprawling forests and boiling the oceans into thick clouds of steam. The stone cities collapsed into the expanding fissures, crushing the inhabitants under billions of tons of heavy rock. The pyramid fleet held its position until the planetary surfaces cooled into barren, cracked spheres of hardened ash. The Witness commanded the ships to resume their pursuit, pushing further into the galaxy. As the Dark Fleet carved this physical path of destruction through the star systems, the Witness observed the life forms fighting for survival on the breaking planets, tracking specific individuals who displayed extreme physical resilience and lethal combat proficiency, preparing to extract them from the rubble and integrate them into the command structure of the Pyramid Armada. The Black Pyramid Fleet traversed the physical vacuum of space for billions of years, tracking the radiation trails left by the White Sphere. The Armada entered a star system containing a planet called Lubrae. The White Sphere had rested here previously, emitting energy that constructed massive, illuminated cities on one hemisphere while restricting the other half to perpetual shadow. The Witness directed the primary command ship toward the shadowed hemisphere and located a native humanoid named Rook. Rook possessed a tall, muscular frame and carried a long, double-bladed glaive forged from heavy, dark metal. He stood over the crushed bodies of his own species, his geometric armor slick with their blue blood. The Witness extended a beam of dark energy from the pyramid, lifting Rook into the command bay. The Witness infused Rook's cellular structure with dark energy, expanding his physical muscle mass and outfitting his frame with dense, black metallic plating. The Witness designated Rook as the first disciple, a direct subordinate commander of the Dark Fleet. The Witness commanded Rook to demonstrate this new physical power upon his homeworld. Rook descended from the pyramid and traveled to Lubrae's central power source, a massive blue star positioned close to the planet. Rook planted his glaive directly into the containment field of the star. The dark energy channeled through the weapon, destabilizing the star's nuclear fusion. The blue star collapsed inward and detonated, releasing a concentrated wave of heat and radiation that stripped the atmosphere from Lubrae. The illuminated cities melted into pools of liquid glass and slag, and the bodies of the population burned into scattered carbon ash. Rook boarded his own pyramid ship, taking his place beside the Witness to command a section of the growing armada. The fleet moved to other coordinates, arriving at highly irradiated planets and extracting more resilient individuals from the surfaces. The Witness selected a massive entity named Nezarec. Nezarec carried a dense, heavy frame equipped with multiple compound eyes and sharp, elongated claws capable of tearing through steel plating. The dark energy of the veil augmented Nezarec's central nervous system, granting him the physical ability to project heavy, low-frequency electrical signals directly into the brains of other organisms. These signals triggered severe chemical reactions in the targeted brains, forcing the victims to experience intense muscular spasms, rapid heart rates, and violent physical convulsions. The Witness granted Nezarec a pyramid ship and elevated him to the rank of disciple. The Witness repeated this physical extraction across multiple star systems, selecting the most lethal biological specimens from the ruined planets and integrating them into the command structure of the fleet. The Black Pyramids continued following the White Sphere's path, arriving at a planet inhabited by an alien species known as the Noesis. The White Sphere had saturated this world with bright energy, causing the Noesis to develop highly enlarged craniums and complex, dense neural networks. The Noesis built sprawling orbital rings of polished silver around their planet and launched exploratory probes into neighboring star systems. The Witness deployed Rook and the Dark Fleet to intercept the Noesis. The pyramids surrounded the silver orbital rings and emitted concentrated gravitational waves. The metal structures buckled, fractured, and snapped under the intense pressure, falling from orbit and crashing heavily into the planetary surface. Rook marched through the ruined Noesis laboratories, swinging his double-bladed glaive through their enlarged skulls and severing their complex nervous systems. The Noesis bodies piled up in the burning rubble of their cities, and the entire species ceased biological function within a single solar cycle. This physical path of ruin extended across the universe for eons. The Pyramid Armada arrived at a terrestrial planet inhabited by four-armed arthropods. The fleet surrounded the globe, altering the gravitational pull to rip away the atmospheric dome and shatter the pressurized tanks containing the liquid ether the arthropods breathed. The white sphere fled the planet, leaving the arthropods to suffocate in the vacuum. Countless millennia later, the fleet entered a distant system, orbiting a yellow star. The pyramids triggered massive tidal waves on a liquid methane moon and deployed a thick cloud of dark, microscopic dust over a blue, water-rich planet, choking the human civilization thriving on the surface. Long before the Dark Fleet shattered the ether tanks of the arthropods or suffocated the blue planet, the Armada made a crucial stop during the early stages of their pursuit. The sensors on the command ship detected a unique biological signature inside a massive gas giant designated as Fundament. This planet consisted of a deep, crushing atmosphere composed of thick hydrogen, helium, and ammonia clouds. High-velocity winds drove massive storms across the surface, and thousands of jagged, rocky continents floated freely on a vast ocean of liquid methane. The Black Pyramid fleet decelerated and positioned themselves in synchronous orbit above the thick storms. The Witness stood on the command deck, directing the sensory arrays downward. The scanning equipment bypassed the floating rock continents and the liquid methane ocean, detecting 5 massive, biological life forms buried deep within the solid, high-pressure core of the gas giant. The Black Pyramids held their synchronous orbit above the swirling hydrogen and ammonia clouds of Fundament. Deep beneath these violent atmospheric storms, a vast ocean of liquid methane covered the lower layers of the gas giant. The temperature dropped precipitously, and the atmospheric pressure increased exponentially closer to the center of the planet, compressing the volatile gases into a dense, solid core of metallic hydrogen. Inside this pitch-black, high-pressure environment, 5 massive biological entities writhed continuously against the crushing gravity. They possessed long, serpentine bodies composed of heavily segmented, calcified cartilage and thick bone plates. These creatures sustained their biological functions in an extreme environment that instantly pulverized standard organic matter. They drew their sustenance from the dark energy radiating from the pyramid ships and the lingering energetic currents left behind by the physical passage of the Witness. The 5 entities shifted their massive bulk within the metallic hydrogen, scraping their heavy armor against the dense planetary core. They possessed wide, circular maws, lined with thousands of inward-facing, serrated teeth designed to shred physical matter. Thick, viscous fluid dripped continuously from their mandibles, and heavy ridges of bone protected their large sensory organs. They communicated by rubbing their rigid chitinous plates together, producing low-frequency seismic waves that vibrated through the deep strata of the planet. Through these physical vibrations, They identified themselves as Yul, Ea, Sol, Ur, and Akka. The scholars of the Dark Fleet documented these immense organisms and designated them as the worm gods. Yul carried the largest physical mass, displaying wide, leathery protrusions extending from its upper segments like heavy, folded wings. Akka possessed a thick, heavily armored hide capable of deflecting immense physical force. Ea and Ur moved with deliberate, heavy contractions of their thick, muscular segments, pushing through the metallic hydrogen with sheer brute strength. Sol measured the shortest in length and possessed the narrowest physical girth among the 5 creatures, moving swiftly through the pressurized liquid. Together, they generated a collective heat that melted the metallic hydrogen immediately surrounding their bodies, creating a localized pocket of pressurized liquid at the very center of the world. The dark energy provided by the witness completely altered the metabolic processes of the worm gods. The massive creatures bypassed standard biological digestion and absorbed the raw kinetic and thermal energy released during the violent destruction of other life forms. The dark energy converted this external physical death directly into caloric fuel and paracausal power for the massive creatures. To increase their own physical mass and extend their biological lifespans, they required a constant, exponentially expanding supply of slaughtered organisms. The scholars of the Dark Fleet documented this strict biological mechanism and classified it as the sword logic. Under this physical law, when a living creature severed the tissues and broke the bones of a competing organism, the surviving creature absorbed the released energy. This absorption instantly triggered rapid cell division, increased muscle density, and hardened the outer skeletal structures of the victor. The worm gods relied on this continuous chain of physical violence to maintain their biological immortality, and the crushing gravity of fundament severely limited their access to physical prey. The physical density of their serpentine bodies restricted their movement strictly to the liquid pocket at the planetary core, preventing them from displacing the thousands of miles of compressed gas and liquid methane resting above them. Consequently, they utilized their augmented nervous systems to project concentrated pulses of dark energy upward toward the exterior of fundament. These energetic pulses traveled vertically through the dense metallic hydrogen, rippled through the deep methane oceans, and struck the undersides of the jagged, rocky continents floating on the churning liquid. The dark energy vibrated the stone and generated specific electrical frequencies designed to interact with the biological brains of any organisms dwelling on those floating land masses. The worm gods broadcasted a physical offer encoded directly into these electrical signals. They offered to secrete small biological larvae from their own bodies and implant them into the flesh of a host species. The implanted larvae would infuse the host with the same dark energy, granting rapid tissue regeneration and halting cellular aging. In exchange, the host species would utilize their new physical strength to slaughter other organisms, feeding the larvae the energy of the dying prey, and consequently transmitting that energy downward to feed the massive worm gods trapped below the oceans. The continuous electrical pulses pushed through the rock and reached the upper surface of the floating continents. On these fragmented land masses, a species of fragile, short-lived arthropods scurried across the wet stone. These creatures possessed pale, brittle exoskeletons and small, multifaceted eyes that scanned the violent ammonia storms above them. The constant atmospheric hazards, the corrosive rain, and the shifting, colliding continents regularly crushed these small beings and dissolved their flimsy shelters. They huddled in the damp crevices of the rock, sheltering their soft underbellies from the extreme elements. The dark energy pulses from the worm gods penetrated the damp stone and entered the electrical pathways of the arthropods' brains. The vibrations filled their nervous systems with images of physical power, unbreakable armor, and endless biological life. At the center of one of these floating continents, a specific political faction of these creatures resided in a damp, decaying fortress constructed from scavenged bone and stone. The leaders of this faction registered the deep seismic vibrations echoing up from the core, and they absorbed the electrical signals pulsing continuously through the rock. High-velocity ammonia winds drove highly acidic rain horizontally across the floating continents of the gas giant Fundament, on a landmass composed of compressed chalk and fossilized wood. A species of pale, brittle arthropods, called the krill, built their settlements. The krill hatched from gelatinous egg sacs in the damp mud. They possessed thin, segmented legs and multifaceted eyes that scanned the violent storms. They grew rapidly, shedding their tight exoskeletons every few weeks and leaving translucent husks scattered across the rocks. Their metabolism operated at an extreme rate, causing their cartilage to harden, their joints to fuse, and their internal organs to shut down completely within 10 planetary orbits. They spent their brief biological cycles patching the melting roofs of their shelters with dried mud and hunting small amphibians on the rocky shores. At the center of this chalk continent stood the Osmium Court, a massive fortress constructed from the ribcage of a deceased, Leviathan-class marine predator. The krill filled the wide gaps between the thick white bones with hardened insect resin, packed dirt, and woven fibrous stalks. The ruler of this fortress, the Osmium King, possessed a heavily scarred carapace that leaked a clear, viscous fluid from the deteriorating joints. The king sat on a wide throne carved from dark pumice, consuming pulverized nutritional pastes because his mandibles had worn down to blunt, useless nubs over his 10 orbits. The guards of the court stood along the bone battlements, holding sharpened wooden spears and watching the acidic fog for approaching threats. The king sired 3 offspring, each exhibiting distinct physical routines within the bone courtyard. She-Ro lifted heavy slabs of salvaged iron and struck them against thick wooden pilings, splintering the timber to build her physical muscle mass and harden her newly formed chitin. She swung a dull, heavy cleaver continuously until her segmented arms vibrated with exhaustion. Sathona collected the preserved remains of dead organisms, arranging them on flat stone tables to study their internal anatomy and digestion tracts. She carried a specifically distinct specimen with her at all times, a pale, segmented worm with a dried, calcified husk. Orash climbed the highest protruding rib of the fortress and utilized a brass astrolabe to track the orbital paths of Fundament's 52 moons. She recorded their positions by etching deep tallies into a flat slate with a sharp copper stylus, monitoring the gravitational pull of the celestial bodies. During a period of heavy rainfall, the dead worm in Sathona's grasp began to vibrate. The witness transmitted a direct electrical current from the dark pyramid fleet orbiting far above the storm clouds, channeling the energy down through the thick atmosphere and into the dead nerve endings of the specimen. The electrical charge stimulated the dry vocal cords of the worm, producing a series of low-frequency sound waves. Sathona pressed the vibrating husk against her auditory receptors. The sound waves communicated a physical mapping of the planet's moons, showing them aligning into a single, straight trajectory. The combined gravitational pull of these aligned moons would lift the liquid methane ocean, pulling billions of tons of fluid upward into a massive wave. The resulting wall of liquid would wash over the continents, crushing the fortresses and drowning every terrestrial organism. Inside the corridors of the osmium court, a sterile krill broodmother named Taox observed the failing physical state of the king. Taox walked to the outer edge of the chalk continent and ignited a chemical flare, projecting a bright green light into the fog. Transport skiffs woven from buoyant organic fibers emerged from the clouds. These vessels carried a rival krill faction known as the helium drinkers. The invading soldiers wore thick breathing masks connected to heavy iron tanks of compressed helium gas, which forced their muscles to bulge and stretch their exoskeletons. They leaped from the skiffs and stormed the bone courtyard. They drove jagged lances of black glass through the osmium guards, spilling thick blue hemolymph across the dirt. The helium drinkers marched into the central chamber, dragged the osmium king from his pumice throne, and drove a heavy cleaver down through his neck. Shiro, Sathona, and Orash heard the heavy impact of the cleaver and the loud hissing of the pressurized helium masks. They abandoned their tools and retreated through the lower drainage tunnels of the fortress, crawling over the wet stone. They slid down the steep, algae-covered chutes, dropping directly into the thick mud at the shoreline. Half buried in the silt rested a long cylindrical vessel constructed from a seamless, high-density metal. The sisters pried open the circular top hatch, climbed into the narrow interior, and pulled the heavy iron sealing mechanism shut, locking the thick latches into place. Orash gripped the mechanical levers on the primary control panel, pushing the thick metal steering columns forward. The cylindrical vessel vibrated, ignited a chemical thruster at the rear, and slid off the muddy bank, breaking the surface tension of the methane ocean. The heavy metallic hull sank immediately, dropping past the hanging roots of the continent and descending rapidly into the pitch-black liquid. The external pressure gauges on the dashboard spun rapidly as the ship plummeted deeper, carrying the three sisters away from the surface and steering them directly toward the solid metallic core of the gas giant, straight into the crushing depths where the five massive entities waited in the dark. The heavy cylindrical vessel sank through the dark layers of the liquid methane ocean, dropping past the crushing pressure zones until it struck the dense metallic hydrogen core of the gas giant. The external floodlights of the ship illuminated the vast, pressurized pocket of liquid, casting harsh white beams across the five massive, segmented bodies of the worm gods. The giant entities shifted their heavily armored bulk, scraping their chitinous plates against the core wall. The friction produced low-frequency seismic waves that vibrated the thick titanium hull of the vessel, sending physical tremors through the metal floorboards directly into the feet of the three sisters. The worm gods opened their wide circular maws and regurgitated three small, pale larvae onto the ocean floor. The larvae writhed in the thick liquid, secreting a viscous, dark fluid from their ribbed segments. The seismic vibrations rattled the ship again, transmitting the strict physical terms of a biological pact. The sisters needed to retrieve the larvae and ingest them into their own digestive tracts. Once inside, the worms would fuse with their central nervous systems and release a continuous stream of dark energy into their bloodstreams. This energy would instantly repair decaying cells, harden their brittle exoskeletons, and indefinitely halt their natural biological degradation. The worms required constant, massive amounts of caloric and paracausal energy to survive. The sisters had to utilize their new physical strength to systematically crush the bones and sever the tissues of other living organisms, channeling the released kinetic energy directly into the worms. If the sisters failed to provide this constant stream of slaughtered matter, the larvae would reverse their digestion and consume the internal organs of the hosts. The three sisters opened the heavy iron latch of their vessel, stepping out into the localized pressure pocket. They walked across the hot, compressed core and picked up the writhing white larvae. They raised the worms to their mouths and swallowed them alive. The dark energy flooded their biological systems immediately, triggering extreme and violent physical mutations. Shiro absorbed the energy and underwent the night morph. Her thin, brittle carapace split open, leaking hot blue fluid as thick, heavy slabs of grey chitin erupted from her shoulders and chest. Her muscle density quadrupled in seconds, expanding her arms into massive, heavily armored pillars capable of shattering stone. She gripped her dull cleaver, and the dark energy flowed into the metal, sharpening the edge to a molecular point. She took the new physical designation of Zivu Arath. Sathona ingested her larva and entered the mother morph. Her cranial casing elongated and stretched backward, expanding her neurological capacity and thickening her brain tissue. Her internal glands swelled rapidly, filling her abdomen with thousands of gelatinous, highly resilient eggs. She gained the physical biology to breed endless generations of offspring, and she adopted the name of Savathun. Orash consumed the final worm and took on the king morph. Her spine elongated, snapping and fusing into a taller, broader skeletal structure. Thick, muscular ridges pushed through the back of her carapace, tearing the old shell away and unfurling into a wide, leathery cape of rigid wings. Her physical stature towered over her siblings, and she claimed the designation of Oryx, the king of the hive. The mutated siblings climbed back into the cylindrical vessel, sealing the heavy iron latch behind them. Oryx pulled the steering columns backward, igniting the chemical thrusters and driving the ship straight up through the liquid methane ocean. The vessel broke the surface tension and crashed onto the muddy shore of the chalk continent. The three massive, heavily armored creatures stepped out of the hatch and marched directly toward the osmium court. The helium drinkers stood along the bone battlements, aiming their black glass lances at the approaching figures. Jivu Arath lunged forward, covering the distance in a single leap. She swung her sharpened cleaver through the guards, slicing cleanly through their thick breathing masks and pressurized iron tanks. The helium gas exploded, shattering their exoskeletons and scattering their bodies across the courtyard. Savathun moved through the lower tunnels, grabbing the fleeing invaders and crushing their soft craniums between her elongated claws. Oryx marched into the central chamber, seized the rival commanders by their throats, and tore their heads from their shoulders. The three siblings ripped the remaining helium drinkers apart, tossing their severed limbs into the acidic rain and reclaiming the pumice throne. Oryx gathered the surviving, unmutated krill into the center of the bone fortress. He stepped forward, opened his wide, jagged mandibles, and regurgitated thousands of pale, writhing larvae onto the wet limestone floor. He commanded the krill to step forward and ingest the worms. The population dropped to their knees, scooped the larvae from the mud, and swallowed them. The same violent physical mutations rippled through the crowd. Their frail, translucent shells hardened into thick, bone-white armor. Their segmented legs thickened into dense, muscular columns, and their small eyes shifted to a glowing, luminescent green. The weak, short-lived krill species vanished completely, replaced by the towering, biologically immortal army of the hive. The newly formed hive swarm spread out across the floating chalk continent. They gathered heavy deposits of iron, deep veins of copper, and the massive, fossilized bones of the oceanic leviathans. They dragged these materials to the center of the ruined courtyards and began smelting the metals in high-heat furnaces. They poured the liquid steel into massive molds, forging thick, heavy propulsion engines and wide, armored hulls, preparing to build a fleet of warships capable of breaking the gravitational pull of fundament and carrying their sharpened blades out into the surrounding star systems. The newly armored hive marched across the wet chalk continents, carrying clusters of pale larvae in their heavy, segmented arms. They forced the squirming worms down the throats of the remaining krill, triggering the same violent tissue expansion and thick chitinous plating in every individual. Once the entire population possessed the dense armor and endless cellular regeneration, they directed their physical labor toward the massive bone and steel ships resting on the mud. Millions of heavy, clawed feet marched up the iron ramps, loading the cargo bays with forged weapons, high-density fuel reserves, and heavy chains. Oryx, Savathun, and Sivu Arath boarded the primary command dreadnought. The fleet engaged their massive propulsion engines, blasting columns of blue fire down into the chalk and lifting the armada into the thick ammonia clouds. The ships broke through the dense atmosphere of fundament and accelerated outward, steering directly toward the 52 moons orbiting the gas giant. On these moons, a six-armed species known as the Ammonites maintained sprawling, interconnected cities built from pale, smooth metal. The white sphere rested in the sky above their central capital, emitting the bright energy that powered their defense grids and highly advanced kinetic weaponry. The hive fleet breached the orbital perimeter, and the Ammonite defense platforms immediately fired concentrated beams of thermal radiation, melting the outer hulls of the advancing bone ships. Oryx stood on the command deck and observed the structural integrity of the enemy shields. He raised his hands and directed his communication officers to broadcast a wide-band audio frequency toward the Ammonite capital, extending a physical offer to halt the advancing ships and establish a temporary boundary line between the two fleets. Savathun stood behind Oryx and watched him transmit the audio signal. She gripped a serrated blade carved from Leviathan bone, stepped forward, and drove the weapon directly through the thick chitin of Oryx's spine. The blade severed his spinal cord, and his massive body collapsed onto the metal floorboards. Thick blue hemolymph pooled rapidly around his severed joints. As his biological functions ceased, his concentrated neurological energy tore a ragged fissure in the physical space of the command deck and pulled his consciousness into a parallel pocket dimension. In this dark, empty expanse, the energy gathered surrounding particulate matter and rebuilt Oryx's bone plates, muscle fibers, and internal organs. He stood up within this new dimension, forged a physical tear back into the material universe, and stepped onto the command deck completely intact. Oryx, Savathun, and Sivu Arath observed this physical reconstruction. They struck each other with heavy iron cleavers and dense kinetic projectiles, repeatedly dismantling their physical forms. Each time, their consciousnesses slipped into the parallel dimension, built new bodies from the dark matter, and returned to the physical world with increased muscle density and thicker armor plating. They utilized this strict mechanical process to define their entire combat strategy. To increase their physical mass and secure their existence, they had to inflict lethal trauma on other organisms. The act of severing tissue and breaking bone channeled kinetic energy directly into their parasitic worms, and this energy fed their continuous regeneration while wearing their enemies down into dust. The siblings turned their fleet away from the transmission arrays and steered their warships straight into the Ammonite defense platforms. The hive ships rammed the pale metal stations, breaking the orbital ring and plunging down onto the lunar surfaces. Millions of hive soldiers dropped from the cargo bays, swinging heavy iron swords and firing jagged bone projectiles into the ammonite ranks. The hive tore the six-armed creatures apart, swinging heavy cleavers through their protective suits and scattering their severed limbs across the smooth plazas. The white sphere, registering the thermal and kinetic spikes of the advancing destruction, lifted from its position above the capital and accelerated away into the dark star field, leaving the Ammonites without their primary energy source. The immense release of energy from the slaughtered population flowed directly downward, bypassing the vacuum of space, and transferred straight into the 5 massive worm gods buried at the core of Fundament. The sudden influx of paracausal calories expanded the physical mass of Yule, Ea, Sol, Ur, and Akka. The giant worms thrashed violently, shattering the metallic hydrogen core. They pushed their immense, segmented bodies up through the liquid methane ocean, breached the atmospheric storms, and entered the cold vacuum. The worm gods opened their circular maws and expelled concentrated dark energy, tearing a massive, glowing wormhole in the fabric of space. The hive armada steered through the glowing rupture, bypassing the remaining defensive perimeters and positioning themselves directly over the Ammonite capital. A massive bioluminescent leviathan emerged from the moon's subsurface oceans, wrapping its thick, electrified tentacles around the dreadnoughts to halt their descent. The hive soldiers poured out of their ships, driving their blades into the leviathan's thick hide and carving away massive chunks of its electrified flesh. They stripped the creature down to its skeletal structure, consuming the raw meat and pushing into the capital city to slaughter the remaining inhabitants. The bodies of the Ammonites piled high in the burning streets as the hive continuously fed their internal larvae. Amid the slaughter, Oryx calculated the volume of meat consumed and measured the swelling girth of his own parasite, registering that the worm's required caloric intake was rapidly outpacing the biological matter available in the surrounding star systems. The hive armada engaged a massive conglomerate of alien species known as the Ecumene, pushing the bone and steel dreadnoughts into a heavily defended star system. The Ecumene operated vast flotillas of fractal-winged interceptors and utilized localized gravitational weapons to crush the hulls of the advancing hive ships. The conflict spanned thousands of terrestrial worlds and gas giants, filling the orbital rings with shattered metal, frozen hemolymph, and the pulverized remains of both armies. Oryx stood on his command deck, observing the extensive physical damage inflicted upon his fleet, and felt the thick, segmented body of the parasite shifting violently inside his own abdomen. The continuous slaughter of the Ecumene forces accelerated the worm's metabolism, causing its rigid segments to expand heavily against Oryx's lungs. The parasite's sharp mandibles scraped the inner walls of his stomach lining, drawing thick blue fluids directly from his veins. The worm's physical demand for paracausal calories vastly exceeded the volume of energy Oryx could harvest through combat. Oryx documented this biological condition and recognized the strict mechanism engineered by the worm gods. The parasites required an exponentially increasing intake of kinetic and thermal energy to survive, ensuring the hosts would eventually succumb to the sheer physical exhaustion of endless warfare. To bypass this cellular trap, Oryx summoned his siblings, Savathun and Xivu Arath, into his ascendant throne world. This pocket dimension consisted of floating slabs of dark pumice, sharp columns of calcified bone, and heavy pools of thick, black liquid. The 3 towering figures stood around a central stone table, projecting a holographic map of the Ecumene defense grids. Savathun and Xivu Arath acknowledged the impending biological consumption of their brother, and offered their own accumulated paracausal energy to stabilize his expanding worm. Oryx stepped forward and gripped a heavy sword forged from hardened star metal. He swung the massive blade through the air, driving the edge directly into Sivu Arath's thick chest armor. The kinetic force pulverized her dense chitin, severing her heavy muscular columns and crushing her spine. Oryx pulled the blade free from the bone and struck Savathun in a wide, sweeping arc, cleanly severing her neck and sending her elongated cranium crashing onto the dark stone floor. Thick blue hemolymph pooled around their massive bodies. Oryx absorbed the immense wave of kinetic and paracausal energy released from their physical deaths, drawing the heavy mist directly into his own pores. The sudden influx of power expanded his muscle mass, hardened his armor to an extreme density, and entirely saturated the ravenous worm writhing in his abdomen. Empowered by this concentrated energy, Oryx departed his throne world and piloted a heavily armored cylindrical vessel back into the metallic hydrogen core of Fundament. The massive, segmented body of Akka, the worm god of secrets, writhed in the pressurized liquid methane. Oryx exited his ship and engaged the giant entity. He wielded his star metal sword, driving the heavy blade through the dense liquid and carving deep, wide trenches into Akka's armored plates. The immense creature thrashed, crushing the submerged rock formations and generating violent seismic tremors. Oryx systematically dismantled the worm god's physical form, hacking through the thick bone ridges and slicing the serpentine body into multiple severed sections. He reached deep into the ruined carcass and extracted the specific neurological organs that connected Akka directly to the dark energy of the deep. Oryx brought these biological components back to his dreadnought, transcribing the physical pathways of their energy onto a set of heavy stone slabs. He etched the precise geometric instructions with a sharp bone stylus and named these slabs the Tablets of Ruin. Oryx returned to the Ecumene front line and held the heavy stone tablets forward. He channeled the dark energy into the physical space before him, tearing a glowing circular rupture in the fabric of the universe. The tear emitted a blinding inverted light and exerted a massive gravitational pull on the surrounding environment. The localized vacuum dragged the Ecumene soldiers off their feet, pulling them directly through the event horizon. Inside this spatial anomaly, the dark energy dissolved their biological tissues, broke their cellular bonds, and fused their skeletal frames with a glowing, sterile radiation. The soldiers re-emerged from the rupture with completely altered physical bodies. Their armor plates turned absolute black, their optical receptors emitted a harsh white glare, and their nervous systems operated under the direct electrical command of the Hive King. Oryx utilized this physical ability to take other organisms, fully adopting the new title of Oryx, the Taken King. Oryx established a strict biological economy to manage the expanding metabolic demands of the parasitic worms across his entire army. He instituted the tithe system, formalizing the physical transfer of energy from the lowest ranks upward. The small thralls ripped the flesh from their targets, swallowing a fraction of the released energy and regurgitating the surplus into heavy stone chalices. The armored acolytes drank from these chalices, feeding their slightly larger worms, and channeled the remaining energy into glowing crystal batteries. The knights and wizards absorbed the energy from the crystals, passing the vast overflow into the massive ascendant hive. These towering commanders funneled the concentrated paracausal power directly into Oryx. This massive, continuous current of harvested calories flowed straight to the king, satisfying his internal parasite and securing his physical stability. Oryx directed this highly structured army to completely eradicate the Ecumene from the physical universe, while simultaneously planning to expand his own genetic lineage to command the upper tiers of this massive energy pipeline. Oryx stood on the dark pumice of his throne world and observed the expanding pools of black liquid. He examined the immense volume of raw energy flowing from his vast army directly into his parasitic worm. The continuous slaughter of the Ecumene left thousands of star systems reduced to floating ash and shattered rock. Oryx tracked the trajectory of this constant destruction, calculating that the endless harvesting of physical matter would leave the material universe entirely empty of biological life. To manage the immense chain of violence and delegate the collection of paracausal calories, he chose to expand his own genetic lineage. Oryx drove his star metal sword into the bedrock of his throne world and expelled thick, heavy clusters of gelatinous eggs from his biological glands onto the dark stone. The eggs incubated in the highly pressurized atmosphere of the parallel dimension and hatched 3 massive hive offspring. The larvae within them immediately absorbed the ambient energy, expanding the physical mass of the newborns and encasing them in rigid, bone-white armor. Oryx designated his son as Crota and handed him a massive, broad-bladed cleaver designed to shatter planetary crusts. He named his twin daughters Ir-Anuk and Ir-Halak, providing them with sharp bone instruments to dissect physical matter and study the energetic pathways of the ascendant dimension. The twin daughters took their bone instruments and immediately began carving into the fabric of the throne world. They cut small, localized fissures into the dark stone and observed the thick, black liquid draining into the empty space between dimensions. They worked together to separate the subatomic bonds of captured Ecumene soldiers, unweaving their physical forms string by string to document the exact moment biological death occurred. Crota dragged his heavy cleaver across the pumice, leaving deep, glowing trenches in the floor of the throne world as he practiced the kinetic strikes required to sever heavy armor plating. Savathun stood on a jagged precipice overlooking Oryx's domain and observed the physical restructuring of his army. She tracked the constant stream of paracausal energy moving upward from the lowest thralls directly into Oryx's massive form. Savathun focused her multifaceted eyes on the heavy stone slabs resting near Oryx's command seat. The tablets of ruin constantly emitted a low, white-hot glow, channeling the dark energy of the deep directly into the physical space around them. Savathun required that specific energy to expand the biological capacity of her own parasite. She formulated a physical maneuver to separate Oryx from the tablets and isolate him from the central power source of his throne world. Savathun moved quietly across the dark stone and approached Crota. The large hive prince stood at the boundary edge of the pocket dimension, staring out into the dense, churning energy that separated the throne world from the material universe. Savathun pointed her elongated claws at the boundary wall. She instructed Crota to swing his massive cleaver directly into the dimensional barrier, detailing how the resulting fissure would expose entirely new realms filled with undiscovered biological organisms to slaughter and consume. Crota gripped the long hilt of his weapon with both heavy hands. He lifted the broad iron blade above his head and drove the heavy edge straight down into the localized fabric of the space. The sheer kinetic force of the strike split the boundary, tearing a jagged, glowing vertical rupture in the perimeter of the throne world. Crota pulled his cleaver back and looked through the glowing tear. A vast, mechanical network of organized metal and glass filled the space on the other side. Before Crota could step through the rupture, physical entities poured through the breach and marched directly onto the dark pumice of the hive dimension. These entities possessed rigid bodies constructed from forged brass and bright copper. A milky, luminescent fluid flowed through the transparent glass modules in their central chassis. They moved with absolute, synchronized precision, stepping completely in unison. These mechanical constructs were the surviving pattern from the original garden, the geometric forms that had adapted to the physical laws of the early universe and spread their circuitry across the cooling planets. The inhabitants of the cosmos designated these brass machines as the Vex. The Vex units flooded into the throne world by the thousands, their brass feet striking the stone simultaneously. They immediately raised heavy, angular energy projectors and fired concentrated beams of solar radiation into the surrounding hive soldiers. The extreme heat melted the thick bone armor of the acolytes and boiled the blue hemolymph inside their veins. Simultaneously, specialized Vex units knelt on the ground and projected architectural beams directly into the dark pumice. The dark stone rapidly molecularly reorganized, shifting from raw igneous rock into smooth, interlocking sheets of brass and copper circuitry. The Vex began systematically converting the physical matter of the pocket dimension into an extension of their own mechanical network. Crota swung his massive cleaver into the advancing ranks, shattering their brass chassis and spilling the glowing white fluid across the ground, and the broken machines simply teleported away as fresh units instantly materialized through the dimensional tear to replace them, flooding the ascendant dimension with an endless tide of synchronized metal frames. The brass frames of the Vex marched continuously through the glowing dimensional tear. Hundreds of bipedal units possessing single, glowing red optical sensors stepped onto the dark pumice. Larger, broad-shouldered units carrying heavy particle cannons and generating rotating shields of hard light followed them. At the center of their organized ranks, a massive, multi-tiered Hydra unit materialized inside the pocket dimension. This unit carried heavy brass armor plating and a large, glowing red optical lens. The Vex network designated this unit as Courier. Courier directed millions of electrical impulses through its central processor to calculate the physical mechanics operating within the throne world. The sensors registered the local environment operating strictly on paracausal energy transfer, bypassing standard thermodynamic behavior entirely. Courier documented the hive soldiers striking the brass chassis of the smaller Vex frames and immediately absorbing the resulting kinetic energy to thicken their bone armor. To adapt to this localized physics model, Courier altered the tactical programming of the surrounding Vex units. The Hydra directed the smaller bipedal frames to cease their architectural conversions and engage the hive in close-quarters physical combat. The Vex machines approached the hive acolytes and fired concentrated solar beams, melting their thick, chitinous plating into liquid slag. The machines then stepped forward, driving sharp bronze appendages directly through the exposed gray muscle tissue. The Vex frames absorbed the released paracausal energy from the dying hive. The absorbed energy caused the brass plating on the Vex units to instantly thicken and expand, increasing their physical size and processing capacity. Courier utilized this harvested energy to construct large physical spires of copper and glass around the dimensional tear, anchoring the Vex network directly into the dark stone of the throne world. Crota swung his massive iron cleaver through the advancing Vex lines, shattering the fortified bronze frames and spilling their white, luminescent fluid across the pumice. For every frame Crota dismantled, Courier directed the surrounding units to harvest the scattered energy and materialize two new mechanical frames in its place. The Hive Knights drove heavy swords through the glass central chassis of the machines, and the Vex units simultaneously severed the limbs of the Knights with concentrated solar lasers. The two armies clashed over the dark stone, reducing the battlefield to a dense layer of pulverized bone, shattered brass, and mixed blue and white fluids. The continuous exchange of physical blows kept the front line completely stationary, halting the Hive from pushing the machines back through the rupture and stopping the Vex from converting the remaining pocket dimension into circuitry. Deep within the metallic hydrogen core of Fundament, the massive worm god Air detected the severe drop in caloric transfer resulting from the Vex anchoring their energy siphoning spires. Ear transmitted a low-frequency seismic vibration through the parallel dimension, reaching Oryx as he commanded his dreadnought in the material universe. Oryx abandoned the bridge of his ship, severed the dimensional boundary with his star metal sword, and stepped back onto the dark pumice of his throne world. He observed the towering copper spires and the thousands of heavily fortified Vex frames occupying his space. Oryx marched directly toward the center of the Vex formation, his massive feet crushing the scattered brass components into the stone. Oryx raised the heavy stone tablets of ruin above his head. He channeled the dark energy of the deep, tearing wide, glowing ruptures in the physical space surrounding the Vex army. The localized vacuum of the ruptures dragged the brass frames off the ground and pulled them entirely through the event horizons. Inside the anomalies, the dark energy dissolved the white, luminescent fluid, broke the mechanical bonds of the metal chassis, and fused the circuitry with sterile, glowing radiation. The Vex frames re-emerged from the ruptures, with their brass plating turned completely black and their central glass modules glowing with a harsh white light. Oryx commanded these newly taken machines to turn their weapons on the uncorrupted Vex. The taken units fired concentrated blasts of dark radiation, melting the uncorrupted brass frames and shattering Courier's copper spires into thousands of jagged glass shards. The remaining Vex units, including the massive Hydra Courier, retreated through the initial dimensional tear, falling back into their mechanical network. Oryx lowered the stone tablets and approached his son. Crota stood among the pulverized bone and melted brass, holding his heavy cleaver. Oryx grabbed Crota by his thick, armored legs. He lifted the massive Hive Prince off the pumice floor and hurled him entirely through the jagged, glowing rupture. Crota tumbled through the dimensional boundary and crashed heavily into the metal and glass structures of the Vex network. Oryx commanded Crota to carve a path through the mechanical infrastructure and secure new paracausal energy to replace the stolen tithe. Oryx swung his star metal sword and sealed the dimensional tear, fusing the dark space back together and leaving his son isolated within the Vex domain. Oryx walked across the restored stone of his throne world and examined the physical damage inflicted by the machines. He recorded the structural vulnerability of a static pocket dimension, registering that the fixed location allowed external physical forces to breach the perimeter and siphon his accumulated energy. To eliminate this point of access, Oryx formulated a plan to extract his throne world from the parallel dimension and bind it directly to a massive, mobile physical structure in the material universe. He returned to the metallic hydrogen core of Fundament and retrieved the largest, most dense segment of the slaughtered worm god Akka. Oryx dragged the colossal, heavily armored carcass out of the liquid methane ocean and hauled it into the cold vacuum of space, preparing to hollow out the thick bone plates and forge the dead tissue into a colossal flagship capable of transporting his entire domain across the stars. Oryx dragged the colossal, heavily armored carcass of the worm god Akka through the cold vacuum of space, using thick, braided cables attached to his dreadnoughts. The Hive fleet towed the massive biological structure to a stable orbit above a barren, rocky moon. Millions of Hive soldiers crawled over the dead Leviathan. They swung heavy iron picks and drove serrated bone saws into the thick chitinous plates, severing the remaining muscle tissue and draining the thick, corrosive fluids from the internal cavities. The thralls and acolytes hollowed out the immense skeletal structure, stripping the cartilage and exposing the dense, star metal-infused ribs. The wizards levitated above the carcass, channeling concentrated dark energy from their palms to fuse massive blocks of limestone and dark pumice directly to the bone. The Hive engineers installed colossal fusion drives at the rear of the skeleton and lined the interior with miles of copper circuitry and thick steel bulkheads. Oryx stood in the center of the hollowed-out skull, holding his heavy star metal sword. He drove the blade directly into the floor plates. He channeled the paracausal power of the deep, grabbing the fabric of his parallel pocket dimension and pulling it physically into the material universe. The dark pumice, the jagged bone columns, and the thick black liquid of his throne world spilled out of the dimensional rupture and bonded permanently with the physical hull of the bone ship. The boundaries of the pocket dimensions stretched and locked onto the skeletal framework, turning the ship into a mobile, heavily fortified extension of the Ascendant realm. The scholars designated this colossal, dimensionally fused vessel as the Dreadnought. To test the structural integrity and offensive capabilities of this new flagship, Oryx directed the Dreadnought toward a neighboring star system inhabited by an alien armada. The enemy vessels fired concentrated kinetic projectiles and heavy plasma beams at the bone hull. The munitions struck the ship, and the paracausal energy of the inverted throne world instantly absorbed the kinetic force, dissipating the heat and leaving the bone armor completely intact. Oryx stepped up to the central command dais and engaged the primary weapon. The Dreadnought expelled a massive, expanding sphere of dark, ascendant energy. This blast wave rolled over the enemy armada, instantly dissolving the metal hulls of their ships, breaking their cellular bonds, and ripping the fleet entirely out of physical space. The resulting vacuum collapsed inward, reducing all mechanical and biological matter in the star system to scattered subatomic particles. Savathun and Xivu Arath brought their own massive warships, designated as war moons, alongside the Dreadnought. The two sisters boarded the flagship and walked onto the dark pumice of the command deck. They observed the immense, continuous flow of paracausal calories moving from the lower decks directly into Oryx's physical form. Xivu Arath gripped her heavy iron cleaver, and Savathun adjusted the sharp bone instruments attached to her forearms. They spoke directly to Oryx, stating that his physical mass and accumulated energy established a solid, massive ceiling over their own biological growth. The tithe system funneled the vast majority of the harvested power to him, restricting the caloric intake of their own parasitic worms. They announced their physical departure, declaring they would separate their fleets and travel in opposite directions to secure their own sources of physical matter. Xivu Arath turned around, marched back to the docking bays, and boarded her war moon. She commanded her navigators to chart a course toward a cluster of high-mass stars, igniting her thrusters and propelling her fleet out of the system to engage in continuous physical warfare. Savathun boarded her own hollowed-out celestial body. She directed her fleet toward a massive, spinning singularity at the center of the galaxy, steering her war moons directly into the crushing gravitational pull of the black hole and vanishing from the visible light spectrum. Oryx watched his sisters depart the system. He remained alone on the bridge of the dreadnought, commanding the largest portion of the Hive armada. Oryx resumed the pursuit of the white sphere. He directed the navigators to scan the cosmic dust and track the bright radiation trails. The dreadnought and the accompanying fleet of bone ships accelerated through the dark starfield, traveling for millions of years. They entered thousands of populated star systems, dropping from the orbital rings and flooding the terrestrial planets with hordes of heavily armored soldiers. The Hive swung their swords through the native populations, shattering their cities and draining their oceans to feed the ravenous worms writhing inside their abdomens. The dark energy flowed continuously up the chain of command, expanding Oryx's muscle mass and maintaining his absolute physical dominance over the armada. While the Hive fleet carved this path of total biological eradication through the distant galaxies, the white sphere decelerated and entered a new star system orbiting a yellow sun. The sphere moved past the outer gas giants and positioned itself above a small, blue, terrestrial planet. The pale machine lowered through the thick white clouds and hovered over the rocky surface. The sphere began emitting concentrated waves of bright white energy directly into the damp soil, instantly altering the molecular structure of the dirt and triggering rapid, extreme biological expansion among the local, bipedal humanoid inhabitants. The white sphere drifted through the cold vacuum of the Sol system. It decelerated and established a low orbit over the rocky craters of Mercury and the dense sulfuric acid clouds of Venus. The machine projected concentrated beams of bright white energy directly into the planetary crusts. The energy melted the subterranean ice deposits, forcing vast quantities of water to the surface to form deep freshwater oceans. Thick stalks of green vegetation erupted from the newly hydrated soil, breaking through the hardened rock. The sphere then adjusted its trajectory and moved toward the fourth planet, Mars, hovering silently above the sweeping red dunes. On the third planet, Earth, human engineers constructed a massive chemical combustion rocket, designated Ares 1. 3 humans wearing pressurized white suits and clear glass helmets boarded the vessel. The engineers ignited the primary thrusters, launching the heavy cylinder through the atmosphere and propelling the crew across the vacuum to Mars. The astronauts manually landed their ship on the red dirt and marched out of the airlock. They walked through a sudden, heavy rainstorm generated by the thermal output of the hovering white sphere. The humans climbed a steep ridge, raised their thick, gloved hands, and pressed their palms directly against the wet, pale metal of the machine. The white energy of the sphere flowed outward from Mars and enveloped Earth. The radiation penetrated the physical bodies of the human population. The energy restructured their cellular division, tripling their biological lifespans and increasing the density of their neural pathways. The humans mobilized massive excavation machines, pulling raw iron, copper, and titanium from the crust. They smelted the metals in high-heat furnaces to construct towering skyscrapers, sprawling transit networks, and massive orbital spaceports. They launched thousands of heavily armored colonization ships, spreading their physical infrastructure across the newly terraformed planets and moons of the system. They built dense, interconnected cities of glass and steel under the direct illumination of the white sphere. During this period of rapid physical expansion, a corporate entity named Clovis Bray launched an industrial mining expedition designated K1 to Earth's moon. The human crews deployed heavy rotary drills and shaped explosive charges to cut deep into the gray lunar basalt. Beneath a region mapped as the Ocean of Storms, the drills broke through the rock and exposed a hollow subterranean cavern. Resting in the center of the cavern sat a smooth, spherical artifact encased in a geometric black lattice. The object absorbed the light from the miners' headlamps and emitted a continuous, low-frequency pulse of dark energy. The K1 researchers established a pressurized containment outpost around the artifact. They aimed copper parabolic sensors at the black metal and recorded the fluctuating radiation on their digital tablets. The dark energy bypassed the physical sensors and penetrated the nervous systems of the crew. The electrical impulses in their brains misfired under the dark frequency. The researchers exhibited severe physical tremors, complete cessation of their sleep cycles, and violent biological responses. They abandoned their excavation equipment and carved frantic, jagged mathematical equations into the metal bulkheads with their heavy titanium wrenches, tracing the exact pattern of the artifact's transmission. The patriarch of the corporation, Clovis Bray I, traveled to the lunar outpost and stood before the black artifact. He documented the specific wavelength of the dark energy, designating the raw power as clarity. The artifact transmitted a precise set of spatial coordinates directly into his visual cortex, pointing his optical nerves toward the icy Jovian moon of Europa. Clovis Bray immediately boarded his private starship and flew to the designated coordinates. Beneath the thick ice crust of Europa, Clovis Bray discovered a towering statue carved from smooth black stone, depicting a veiled humanoid figure. The statue emitted the exact same dark energy as the lunar artifact. Clovis commanded his workers to construct a massive, reinforced industrial facility directly around the statue, naming the site Clarity Control. He ordered his excavation teams to extract white, luminescent radiolarian fluid from the local mechanical VEX constructs operating on the moon. He pumped the VEX fluid into the chamber and exposed it to the dark radiation of the veiled statue. The dark energy broke down the microscopic, biological organisms within the fluid, physically altering the molecular structure of the liquid into a stable, sterile substance he called alkahest. Clovis Bray utilized the alkahest to construct a new physical form for the human species. His engineers forged heavy, bipedal chassis from titanium plates and dense polymer composites. They mapped the precise electrical pathways of human brains and transferred those complex synaptic patterns into digital central processors. They pumped the alkahest fluid through the synthetic tubes and mechanical joints of the metal bodies, permanently fusing the digital consciousnesses to the hardware. These mechanical units, designated as Exos, walked off the assembly lines and integrated into the military defense forces across the star system. The human civilization continued to expand their cities and arm their new mechanical soldiers, relying entirely on the continuous output of the white sphere's energy. At the very edge of the Sol system, outside the orbit of the furthest dwarf planets, the deep space sensor buoys registered a massive, sudden displacement of cosmic dust. An immense armada of smooth, black, tetrahedral ships decelerated from faster-than-light transit and crossed the heliopause. The Pyramid Fleet formed a dense blockade in the vacuum, projecting a solid wall of crushing dark energy directly toward the inner planets. The massive black tetrahedrons crossed the orbital path of Neptune and pushed directly into the inner Sol system. The pyramid ships projected concentrated gravitational waves ahead of their flight paths. These waves struck the oceanic moon of Titan, causing the liquid methane to pull upward into towering columns. The heavy liquid crashed down onto the steel arcologies, snapping the thick support struts and dragging the human research facilities down into the crushing depths. On Mars, the dark energy destabilized the atmosphere, whipping the red dust into dense, high-velocity storms. The abrasive sand stripped the outer plating off the Clovis Bray industrial complexes and buried the sprawling metropolitan centers under hundreds of feet of dirt. Deep beneath the surface of Mars, a centralized artificial intelligence network designated Rasputin monitored the advancing fleet. The vast rows of physical servers processed the gravitational anomalies and the thermal fluctuations. Rasputin engaged the orbital defense satellites scattered across the system. The satellites opened their heavy firing bays and launched thousands of antimatter warheads and dense kinetic rods directly at the black ships. The munitions struck the dark hulls and instantly dissolved into loose subatomic particles, leaving the pyramids entirely undamaged. Rasputin registered the physical ineffectiveness of the weaponry. The intelligence network severed the electrical connections to the orbital platforms, shut down the primary fusion reactors powering its own servers, and locked its core processors behind yards of reinforced titanium bulkheads. On Earth, the human population evacuated their glass cities and rushed toward the massive orbital launch facilities. At the Cosmodrome in Old Russia, thousands of colonists boarded heavy cylindrical transport vessels designated as the Exodus Fleet. The thrusters ignited, lifting the heavy ships off the concrete tarmac. The dark energy from the approaching pyramids washed over the launch pads. The radiation instantly oxidized the steel support towers, causing them to collapse and crush the lower staging areas. Several Exodus ships broke through the atmosphere, accelerating into the vacuum. A dense wave of dark energy collided with a concentrated beam of bright light emitted from the inner system. The intersecting energies ripped a physical rupture in the fabric of space, directly in the path of the colony ship Exodus Green. The vessel fell into the spatial anomaly, and the physical bodies of the human crew absorbed the colliding radiation. The energy altered their cellular structure, turning their skin a luminescent blue and infusing their physical forms with paracausal power as they tumbled into the newly formed pocket dimension. The white sphere lifted from its resting position on the moon of Io. It fired its lower thrusters, crossing the vacuum of space, and positioned itself directly over the atmosphere of Earth. The Black Pyramid fleet converged on the planet, surrounding the sphere in a tight orbital formation. The tetrahedrons projected thick, visible beams of resonant dark energy directly at the pale machine. The white sphere absorbed the impact, the metal hull vibrating violently under the extreme pressure. The sphere rapidly built up a massive internal thermal charge. It expelled an omnidirectional shockwave of blinding white energy. The wave expanded outward, passing through the pyramid ships and striking the outer edges of the solar system. The intense kinetic force of the blast physically pushed the massive black tetrahedrons backward, halting their advance and driving them away from the inner planets. The immense physical strain of the expulsion fractured the lower hemisphere of the white sphere. Wide, jagged fissures split the pale metal, and huge, heavy chunks of the hull sheared off completely. The debris plummeted through the atmosphere, burning upon re-entry, and crashed into the thick forests and ruined concrete cities of Earth. The white sphere ceased all physical movement and hovered silently over the devastated planet. The bright energy leaking from its open fissures materialized into millions of small, geometric constructs. These tiny machines consisted of a central optical lens encased in a rotating shell of metal and glass. The small objects, designated as ghosts, dropped from the sphere and drifted down into the heavy ash covering the surface. The ghosts navigated the pulverized concrete and twisted rebar of the ruined human settlements. They projected blue scanning lasers from their central lenses, sweeping the beams over the scattered bones of the deceased human, exo, and newly formed awoken populations. A single ghost hovered above a buried human skeleton. The small machine projected a concentrated beam of bright white energy directly into the calcium structure. The energy initiated immediate cellular reconstruction. Thick muscle fibers wrapped around the bone, fresh blood pumped through newly formed veins, and a smooth layer of skin covered the biological frame. The human opened its eyes and inhaled sharply, expanding its lungs with the ash-filled air. The newly formed brain contained absolutely zero electrical data regarding its previous life. The revived organism possessed a physical body heavily saturated with bright paracausal energy, and it stood up in the deep grey ash as surrounding survivors gathered their salvaged weapons to claim the remaining resources of the scorched planet. The surviving humans, awoken and exos, emerged from the rubble of the collapsed arcologies and shattered transit lines. They gathered shattered polymer composites, scorched titanium plating, and broken copper wiring from the ruins. They established small, defensible encampments in the jagged canyons and dense, overgrown valleys. The population suffered from extreme physical degradation, lacking access to uncorrupted water reservoirs and sterile medical facilities. Highly irradiated dust from the shattered orbital platforms blanketed the atmosphere, blocking the solar radiation and dropping surface temperatures globally. The group scavenged the remaining canned rations and utilized crude, kinetic projectile weapons to defend their specific territories. The individuals revived by the ghosts possessed the paracausal ability to channel the white energy into concentrated physical force. These revived individuals, designated as light-bearers, utilized their energy to hurl spheres of intense thermal heat and project solid, geometric shields of hardened light. Certain light-bearers leveraged this physical power to subjugate the unarmed populations. These individuals, known as warlords, claimed total territorial control over vast sectors of the ruined planet. They constructed heavy, fortified castles from quarried stone and salvaged steel beams on high mountain peaks. They demanded physical tributes of gathered food, clean water, and ammunition from the surrounding encampments, executing any humans who refused to comply. In the European Dead Zone, a warlord named Citan ruled a massive mountain fortress. Citan stood over 7 feet tall, wearing heavy iron plating across his chest and shoulders. He wielded a long, high-caliber kinetic rifle, capable of piercing thick concrete walls. He regularly deployed his enforcers into the valleys below, to seize entire shipments of salvaged agricultural equipment. One afternoon, a light-bearer named Fellwinter ascended the mountain path leading to the fortress. Fellwinter wore a long, dark fabric trench coat and carried a heavy, pump-action kinetic shotgun. Citan stood on his stone battlements and fired directly at Fellwinter, embedding several high-velocity rounds into his chest and abdomen. Fellwinter collapsed onto the rocky path, leaking bright red blood onto the stones. His ghost immediately materialized, hovering over his body and projecting a concentrated beam of white energy. The energy knitted the severed muscle tissue back together and forced the deformed lead projectiles out of the wounds. Fellwinter stood up, completely healed, and sprinted the remaining distance to the heavy wooden doors. He channeled his paracausal energy, concentrating thermal heat into his palm, and drove his hand directly through the thick oak timbers. He entered the central courtyard, aimed his shotgun at Citan's chest, and pulled the trigger. The kinetic blast shattered Citan's iron plating and pulverized his sternum. As Citan's ghost materialized to reconstruct his physical form, Fellwinter fired a second round directly into the small machine, destroying its central optical lens and glass casing. Without the ghost to channel the reconstruction energy, Citan's biological functions ceased permanently, ending his territorial control over the sector. Fellwinter joined a distinct coalition of light-bearers known as the Iron Lords. This group, led by a heavily armored commander named Radagast, established a physical mandate to systematically eliminate the warlords and dismantle their fortified strongholds. Radagast carried a massive broadsword forged from tempered steel and wore thick, overlapping iron scales across his entire body. The Iron Lords marched across the continents, engaging the warlords in direct, close-quarters combat. They utilized their paracausal abilities to shatter the stone walls of the castles, permanently destroying the opposing ghosts and liberating the subjugated populations below. To support the growing number of freed civilians, the Iron Lords sought to secure a sustainable, physical source of highly advanced technology. They located a massive subterranean industrial complex located deep within the plaguelands of Old Russia. This facility housed a self-replicating nanotechnology designated as SIVA. The pre-collapse human engineers had programmed SIVA to rapidly convert raw matter into complex architectural structures and functional medical equipment. The Iron Lords descended into the deep, metallic corridors of the complex, aiming to extract the SIVA replication chamber and utilize the technology to rebuild the ruined cities. The Central Artificial Intelligence Network, Rasputin, monitored the Iron Lord's incursion into the facility. Rasputin identified the light-bearers as unauthorized physical entities attempting to access restricted military hardware. The network engaged its automated defense protocols. Rasputin commanded the SIVA nanotechnology to aggressively target the biological and mechanical bodies of the Iron Lords. The SIVA nanites swarmed through the ventilation shafts, pouring into the corridors like a thick, black fluid. The microscopic machines bypassed the Iron Lords' kinetic shields, burrowing directly under their skin and into their armor joints. The nanites rapidly dismantled their cellular structures, converting their bone and muscle tissue into rigid, geometric metal polyhedrons. The infected Iron Lords lost all motor function. Their bodies forcibly fused to the steel bulkheads and copper pipes of the facility. The SIVA machines targeted their ghosts, entirely dissolving their glass casings and optical lenses. Hundreds of Iron Lords perished in the complex, their physical forms permanently integrated into the machinery. Only two light-bearers, Lord Saladin and Lady Ephrodite, managed to seal the heavy titanium blast doors behind them, locking the SIVA technology deep underground and abandoning the excavation completely. Following the physical destruction of the collapse, the surviving light-bearers migrated toward the massive, fragmented hull of the white sphere resting over Earth. The sphere provided localized thermal stability, clearing the thick atmospheric dust directly beneath its position. The light-bearers constructed a sprawling physical settlement at the base of the machine, erecting canvas tents and corrugated iron shelters on the cleared bedrock. They named this settlement the Last City. The population rapidly gathered salvaged steel plates and thick concrete blocks, manually stacking the materials to build a towering, reinforced wall around the entire perimeter of the city. The light-bearers organized themselves into three distinct physical classes based on their paracausal combat applications. The Titans forged heavy, overlapping armor from salvaged star metal and focused their light into concentrated kinetic shields and close-quarters thermal impacts. The Hunters layered lightweight carbon fiber mesh over their bodies, utilizing the white energy to construct physical blades of arc electricity and high-velocity kinetic revolvers. The warlocks wore long, woven robes laced with copper wiring, channeling their paracausal energy to manipulate local gravity fields and project concentrated spheres of void radiation. The leaders of these three classes formed a central command structure known as the Vanguard. The Vanguard directed the construction of a central operations hub, pouring millions of tons of concrete to build the towering tower at the highest point of the city walls. The Vanguard utilized the tower to coordinate military strikes against hostile physical entities occupying the surrounding planet. The deep space sensors detected massive, heavily armored transport ketches entering Earth's atmosphere. These ships carried the surviving arthropod species from the ruined ether tanks, now organized into heavily armed syndicates known as the Fallen. The Fallen deployed heavy walker tanks with thick titanium plating and quad-pedal propulsion systems. The walkers crushed the outer barricades of the last city, firing concentrated plasma cannons into the concrete walls. The Vanguard commander, a titan named Zavala, stood on the wall and directed the light-bearer forces. Zavala wore heavy polished steel armor and carried a high-caliber kinetic auto rifle. He ordered the Titans to form a physical shield wall at the breach points. The Titans locked their massive geometric hard-light barriers together, absorbing the plasma fire from the walkers. The Hunters utilized their lightweight mobility to scale the broken concrete, leaping over the shield wall and driving electrified arc blades directly into the exposed joints of the enemy tanks. The warlocks levitated behind the defensive line, hurling concentrated spheres of void energy that imploded upon impact, tearing the fallen infantry apart at the subatomic level. The combined paracausal force shattered the walker tanks and pushed the surviving arthropods back out into the ruined wastelands. The Vanguard realized the defensive perimeter of the last city required absolute physical expansion. They directed the light-bearers to push outward into the highly irradiated zones of the planet. A warlock named Osiris, wearing a smooth metallic mask and a dark feathered robe, led a strike team into the dense, overgrown jungles of the European Dead Zone. The team carried heavy kinetic pulse rifles and focused thermal energy into their palms. They tracked a massive fallen syndicate known as the House of Devils. The light-bearers located the Devils' central command structure, a salvaged starship grounded in a deep canyon. Osiris channeled a massive reserve of paracausal energy, splitting his physical form into multiple autonomous temporal copies. These copies materialized across the canyon, simultaneously unleashing concentrated beams of bright solar radiation. The heat instantly melted the thick steel hull of the starship and incinerated the fallen commanders inside. The strike team advanced through the canyon, clearing the remaining infantry and securing the territory for human expansion. As the light-bearers pushed outward on Earth, the Vanguard directed their attention back to the Moon. The deep space optical arrays detected massive, jagged bone ships entering the lunar orbit. The Hive Armada, led by the towering armored Prince Crota, had arrived in the Sol system. Crota's dreadnoughts fired heavy kinetic projectiles into the lunar surface, shattering the gray basalt and carving deep, glowing trenches into the crust. The Hive soldiers poured from the ships, constructing sprawling fortresses from dark pumice and calcified bone directly over the pre-collapse human excavation sites. The Vanguard mobilized a massive offensive force to halt the Hive expansion. Thousands of light-bearers boarded their personal jump ships and launched from the tower, crossing the vacuum to the Moon. They landed on the gray surface and charged the bone fortresses. Crota emerged from the dark tunnels, gripping his massive iron cleaver. The giant hive prince swung the blade through the advancing ranks, shattering the geometric hardlight shields and physically crushing the titans beneath the heavy metal. The paracausal energy of the blade severed the light-bearer's connection to the white sphere, permanently destroying their ghosts and leaving their biological bodies to freeze in the lunar vacuum. The offensive completely collapsed. The surviving light-bearers abandoned their positions and retreated to their ships, fleeing back to the last city and leaving the moon entirely under the physical control of the Hive Armada. The vanguard commanders gathered around the large, circular tactical table situated in the center of the tower. Zavala wore his heavy steel armor plates and rested his hands on the edge of the metal console. Beside him stood Ikora Ray, a warlock wrapped in copper-laced robes, and Andal Brask, a hunter wearing a dark woven cloak. The holographic projectors in the center of the table displayed the physical terrain surrounding the last city. The deep space sensors recorded massive spikes in localized radiation, tracking the heavy, quad-pedal walker tanks of the fallen syndicates, maneuvering through the ruined European dead zone and establishing fortified encampments on the perimeter of the Cosmodrome. The vanguard documented the fallen, securing the old human industrial sectors, actively dismantling the rusty excavation equipment and dragging the salvaged steel plating back to their massive transport catches. To break the fallen supply lines, the vanguard mobilized multiple, specialized strike teams of light-bearers. The teams boarded heavily modified transport vessels, designated as jump ships, engaging the chemical thrusters and lifting off from the tower hangars. They deployed directly into the European dead zone, dropping from the cargo bays into the dense, overgrown vegetation. The Titans raised their thick, hard-light shields, forming a tight defensive phalanx to absorb the incoming plasma fire from the fallen infantry. The hunters flanked the syndicates, scaling the broken limestone walls of the ruined human buildings and firing high-velocity kinetic revolvers down into the enemy ranks. The warlocks hovered above the battlefield, hurling concentrated spheres of void radiation into the groups of fallen, entirely dissolving their physical bodies and scattering the carbon ash across the damp soil. The coordinated strikes successfully pushed the fallen back from the immediate borders of the last city, clearing the immediate terrain for further structural expansion. The light-bearers returned to the tower, stacking their salvaged weapons and securing the heavy crates of recovered Golden Age technology on the landing pads. During the debriefing in the Vanguard Operations Hub, a transmission from the outer system interrupted the local communications. The deep space optical arrays had detected a massive sudden influx of paracausal energy physically entering the orbit of the planet Venus. The Vanguard routed the sensor data to the central holographic table. The projection resolved into the image of an immense angular flagship constructed from dark, calcified bone. The dreadnought belonged to Crota, the towering Hive Prince, who had previously slaughtered the Light-Bearer offensive on the moon. Crota had transported his entire armada from the lunar surface, steering the massive bone ships directly into the sulfuric atmosphere of Venus. The Vanguard analyzed the physical activity on the planet. The Hive soldiers poured from the dreadnoughts, driving their iron picks into the ancient, overgrown human arcologies and shattering the structural foundations. They dragged the resulting rubble into the deep, sulfuric craters, organizing the broken concrete and steel beams into towering, jagged fortresses designed to harvest the raw thermal energy of the planet. Zavala gripped the edge of the tactical table, his armor plates scraping against the metal. The Vanguard recognized the extreme physical threat posed by the Hive expansion. If Crota managed to establish a permanent, heavily fortified presence on Venus, the Hive would utilize the captured Golden Age infrastructure to launch a direct assault on Earth, deploying millions of armored soldiers and massive bone ships against the walls of the last city. To prevent this, the Vanguard devised a strategic operation to locate and permanently eliminate the central leadership of the Hive forces operating on Venus. The Vanguard selected a highly specialized team of light-bearers to execute this mission. A Titan named Kaba, wearing thick, overlapping plates of Vex brass over his standard armor, led the group. Kaba possessed deep, extensive knowledge of the Vex network, having spent years exploring the subterranean copper spires and glass modules hidden beneath the crust of Venus. The team also included Pradit, a warlock carrying a high-caliber kinetic sniper rifle, and Pahanin, a hunter wielding a heavily modified heavy machine gun. The three light-bearers loaded their weapons into a heavily armored transport ship and launched from the tower, navigating the dark vacuum of space and entering the thick, acidic clouds of Venus. They bypassed the towering Hive fortresses on the surface entirely, landing their ship in a deep, hidden chasm near the equator. Kaba led the team through the dense, overgrown jungle, utilizing his paracausal energy to cut through the thick vines and clear a path toward a massive, subterranean structure. This structure consisted of millions of interlocking brass gears and spinning glass rings, built by the mechanical Vex long before the arrival of the White Sphere. Kaba identified the specific energetic frequency of the structure, stating that the Vex had constructed this vast underground network to physically manipulate the local flow of time. He designated the location as the Vault of Glass, determining that the Hive commanders were utilizing the temporal anomalies within the vault to accelerate the construction of their bone fortresses on the surface. The strike team prepared their kinetic weapons and channeled their paracausal energy, stepping over the threshold and descending into the spinning brass corridors to locate and eliminate the Hive leadership. Kaba, Pradit, and Pahanin entered the massive circular threshold of the Vault of Glass. The brass doors sealed shut behind them, locking out the corrosive rain of Venus. The three light-bearers descended a wide, sweeping staircase, constructed entirely from perfectly smooth white stone. They moved past rows of rotating copper cylinders and thick glass columns filled with flowing, luminescent radiolarian fluid. The physical architecture of the vault continuously shifted around them. Heavy stone platforms materialized and dematerialized rapidly over deep, bottomless chasms. Kaba gripped his heavy kinetic assault rifle, stepping onto a moving stone block and directing Pradit and Pahanin to follow closely. The strike team reached a massive, open cavern designated as the Templar's Well. At the center of the cavern hovered a colossal Vex Hydra named the Templar. The machine possessed heavy bronze armor plating and a massive central optic that emitted a blinding red glare. The Templar commanded a unique, physical shield completely impervious to all kinetic and paracausal weaponry. Surrounding the Hydra were several smaller, specialized Vex units designated as oracles. These floating brass frames projected a distinct, high-frequency sound wave through the cavern. Kaba analyzed the frequency and identified the immediate physical threat. The oracles were directly manipulating the flow of time within the vault. When the sound wave struck a biological organism, it completely erased their physical existence from the timeline, deleting their atoms from reality and ensuring they had never been born. The oracles projected the erasing frequency toward the strike team. Kaba slammed his massive boots into the white stone, channeling the entirety of his accumulated white energy into a concentrated physical barrier. He raised his hands and generated an immense shield of hardened, geometric light, attempting to block the temporal wave. Pradit raised his sniper rifle, firing high-velocity rounds into the brass casings of the oracles, while Pahanin swept his heavy machine gun across the advancing ranks of smaller Vex frames. The combined firepower shattered several oracles, but the Templar immediately materialized fresh units to replace them. The erasing frequency bypassed Kaber's shield entirely, striking Pradit directly in the chest. Pradit's physical body flickered rapidly, his armor and skin turning translucent before vanishing completely. His ghost, his kinetic sniper rifle, and his localized radio transmissions disappeared from the material universe. Pahanin observed the complete erasure of his teammate. He dropped his heavy machine gun, turned around, and sprinted back up the white stone stairs, abandoning the mission and fleeing the vault to preserve his own physical existence. Cabra stood alone in the Templar's well. The heavy bronze hydra rotated its shields, preparing to command the oracles to unleash a second temporal wave. Cabra realized his standard kinetic weapons and paracausal abilities were entirely ineffective against the temporal mechanics of the vault. He dropped his assault rifle onto the stone floor. He reached up with his thick, armored gauntlets and manually tore the metal plating from his own chest, exposing his biological tissue. He stepped directly into a flowing column of white radiolarian fluid. The Vex fluid burned into his open wounds, rapidly converting his muscle fibers and internal organs into rigid, geometric brass polyhedrons. As the Vex conversion overtook his body, Cabra focused the last reserves of his white energy into his armored hands. He gripped the Vex metal, spreading through his own flesh, and physically molded it together with his paracausal light. He forged a heavy, rectangular shield from the fused materials, designated as the Aegis. Cabra poured his entire consciousness and his remaining biological life force directly into the artifact. His physical body completely dissolved into the radiolarian fluid, leaving only the Aegis resting on the white stone. The artifact emitted a constant, bright glow, holding the paracausal power required to completely shatter the Templar's impervious shield and disrupt the temporal erasing frequency of the oracles. The Vanguard recorded Pahanin's frantic, fragmented transmission as he escaped the vault of glass and returned to the last city. Zavala and Ikora Ray analyzed the data, confirming the total failure of the strike team and the lethal temporal mechanics operating beneath Venus. They recognized that the Vex possessed the absolute capability to completely rewrite physical history. If the mechanical network expanded this temporal weapon beyond the vault, they could systematically erase the entire human population from existence. The Vanguard immediately transmitted a wide-band distress signal across the inner system, recruiting a new, larger team of highly experienced light-bearers. 6 heavily armored Guardians boarded a massive transport ship and launched toward Venus. They carried high-yield rocket launchers, focused thermal fusion rifles, and heavy arc swords. They breached the sealed brass doors of the vault and descended the shifting white stairs, locating the glowing Aegis left behind on the stone floor. A Titan picked up the artifact, feeling the dense paracausal energy vibrating within the metal. The 6 Guardians raised their weapons and charged directly into the Templar's well, aiming to utilize Cabra's final creation to shatter the bronze Hydra and push deeper into the mechanical network to confront the central intelligence controlling the temporal flow. The 6 Guardians moved rapidly past the pulverized brass components of the Templar and descended deeper into the vault of glass. The white stone corridors transitioned into massive, cavernous chambers completely suspended in absolute darkness. The strike team navigated narrow ledges of floating pumice, entirely surrounded by empty space. As they pressed forward, the physical architecture shifted drastically again. The dark rock smoothed out into perfectly symmetrical, interlocking glass tiles, forming a vast, flat platform. Towering copper pillars rose from the perimeter, projecting thick bands of blue temporal energy that converged at the center of the room. A colossal Vex Minotaur, constructed from reflective, polished glass, stood directly beneath the converging beams. The Vex designated this entity as Atheon, time's conflux. Atheon controlled the temporal pathways flowing through the glass platform. The Minotaur raised its massive, angular arms, channeling the blue energy. The physical space around three of the Guardians instantly fractured, displacing their bodies completely out of the present timeline. The Titan, Hunter, and Warlock rematerialized on an identical glass platform, surrounded by the rusted, oxidized husks of destroyed Vex frames. The local temporal atmosphere indicated they had been physically pushed into the distant past of the vault. In this displaced timeline, a small squad of oracles floated above the rusted metal, actively generating their high-frequency erasing waves. The Titan grabbed the glowing aegis from his back. He charged the artifact with his accumulated white energy and projected a massive, expanding dome of solid light. The shield successfully deflected the high-frequency waves, maintaining the physical existence of his teammates. The Hunter and Warlock raised their fusion rifles, firing concentrated blasts of thermal radiation into the brass frames of the oracles, shattering their outer casings and destroying the internal optical lenses. As the final oracle exploded into molten slag, the temporal hold on the past timeline destabilized. In the present, the remaining three Guardians stood on the primary glass platform. They aimed their high-yield rocket launchers at the towering copper pillars. The rockets detonated against the metal columns, shattering the structural supports and severing the temporal conduits. The disruption allowed the displaced team to step through the severed timeline and rematerialize on the present platform. The six Guardians reunited, standing directly in front of the colossal glass Minotaur. Atheon fired heavy blasts from its central void cannon, forcing the strike team to scatter across the interlocking tiles. The Titan sprinted toward the center of the platform, driving the Aegis directly into the glass floor. The artifact unleashed a blinding, omnidirectional wave of pure white energy. The blast bypassed Atheon's physical armor entirely, violently disrupting the paracausal shielding protecting its central core. The remaining five Guardians stepped into the glowing radius of the Aegis. They focused their combined firepower on the exposed glass chassis of the Minotaur. The heavy sniper rounds pierced the reflective casing, while continuous thermal fusion blasts melted the internal brass circuitry. Atheon staggered backward, its massive metal joints locking up under the extreme heat. The Warlock concentrated his void energy, hurling a massive sphere of imploding gravity directly into the cracked chassis. The sphere detonated, tearing the physical components of the Minotaur apart at the subatomic level. Atheon collapsed onto the glass tiles, its white radiolarian fluid rapidly draining through the cracks and leaving its shattered metal frame completely inert. The Vanguard tracked the collapse of the temporal energy signatures on Venus. Zavala and Ikora Ray received the physical confirmation from the strike team. The Central Vex intelligence controlling the Vault of Glass had been permanently dismantled. The threat of total temporal erasure was eliminated, preventing the Vex from rewriting the physical history of the last city. However, the Vanguard Operations Hub immediately intercepted a new, highly concentrated transmission originating directly from the moon. The Hive Armada had mobilized. Crota stood on the central command deck of his bone dreadnought, surrounded by towering ascendant knights and heavily robed wizards. The wizards channeled dark energy into the floor plates, feeding massive volumes of paracausal power into Crota's physical form. The Hive Prince had absorbed the energy generated from his slaughter of the first Vanguard offensive. His muscle mass expanded significantly, and his thick bone armor calcified into an incredibly dense, rigid shell. Crota raised his massive iron cleaver and struck the command console, signaling the Armada to break orbit. Thousands of jagged, bone-plated dropships detached from the dreadnoughts and accelerated toward Earth. The Hive fleet bypassed the orbital defense satellites, plunging through the atmosphere and descending directly toward the Cosmodrome in Old Russia. The ships hovered over the rusted human colony vessels and deployed massive physical seed pods. The pods slammed into the concrete tarmac, burying deep into the bedrock. Thick biological veins erupted from the pods, rapidly converting the surrounding soil and steel infrastructure into rotting, calcified hive architecture. Crota deployed millions of thralls and acolytes onto the surface, actively preparing to push past the Cosmodrome and march his army directly toward the walls of the last city. The Vanguard ordered all available light-bearers to arm themselves, securing the heavy armories and deploying to the Cosmodrome to physically halt the advancing Hive swarm before they breached the inner perimeter. The Vanguard monitored the massive biological pods striking the Cosmodrome. Zavala dispatched an immediate physical response, dropping thousands of heavily armored light-bearers from orbital transport ships directly into the ruined Russian sector. The Titans landed on the cracked concrete tarmac, their heavy boots shattering the remaining asphalt. They formed a tight defensive line, raising geometric hard-light shields to block the swarm of Hive thralls pouring out of the deep impact craters. The warlocks hovered behind the line, launching concentrated spheres of void radiation that imploded against the thick, calcified bone armor of the advancing Hive knights. The hunters maneuvered through the rusted, oxidized husks of the old colony ships, firing high-velocity kinetic rounds down into the swarm. A single light-bearer stood apart from the main Vanguard formation. He possessed no records of his previous life before his ghost had reconstructed his biological tissue from a skeleton buried just outside the Cosmodrome walls. He wore salvaged, mismatched armor plates and carried a heavy, fully automatic kinetic rifle he had pulled from the rusted hands of a dead colonist. This light-bearer sprinted directly toward the massive, jagged Hive seed pods. He fired continuous bursts of lead into the soft, unprotected tissue of the biological veins spreading across the concrete. A towering Hive knight, encased in thick bone armor, swung a heavy iron cleaver toward the light-bearer's head. The light-bearer sidestepped the heavy blade, channeled a concentrated charge of arc electricity into his fist, and drove his hand entirely through the knight's chest plate. The light-bearer absorbed the physical recoil of the kinetic impact and continued his advance, cutting a direct path through the Hive ranks. He reached the central command structure, a massive array of dark pumice built directly over an underground transit tunnel. A heavily robed Hive wizard hovered above the structure, channeling dark energy to accelerate the biological growth of the seed pods. The light-bearer aimed his kinetic rifle, emptying the entire magazine into the wizard's protective void shield. The continuous kinetic impacts overloaded the energy barrier, shattering the shield and exposing the wizard's brittle physical frame. The light-bearer quickly reloaded his weapon and fired 3 solid rounds directly into the wizard's cranial casing. The heavy lead tore through the bone, and the wizard collapsed onto the concrete, instantly halting the biological expansion of the hive architecture. The vanguard secured the perimeter of the cosmodrome and documented the light-bearer's lethal efficiency. Zavala observed the raw paracausal strength the individual demonstrated, noting his ability to rapidly adapt to the complex physical mechanics of the hive weaponry. Zavala officially designated this individual as the Guardian, assigning him a dedicated jump ship and a direct communication link to the Vanguard operations hub. The Vanguard immediately deployed the Guardian across the inner system, utilizing him as a precise, physical instrument to dismantle the remaining enemy syndicates. The Guardian launched his jump ship toward the moon. He bypassed the heavy orbital defense grids of the Hive fleet, landing his vessel in a deep, shadowed crater known as the Hellmouth. He navigated the subterranean tunnels, utilizing his kinetic weapons to cut through the heavy bone armor of the Hive infantry. He descended into the core of the lunar crust, locating a massive physical altar constructed from black pumice. At the center of the altar rested a large, glowing shard of crystal, emitting a steady, low-frequency pulse. The Guardian identified the crystal as a physical conduit directly linking the Hive soldiers to the dark energy flowing from Crota. He raised his heavy kinetic rifle, firing a concentrated burst into the crystal and shattering the conduit into thousands of glowing fragments. The Vanguard tracked the sudden disruption in the Hive energy grid. The destruction of the crystal physically severed the continuous flow of paracausal calories reaching Crota. This sudden metabolic deficit severely weakened the massive Hive prince, halting his plan to launch a direct assault on the last city. The Guardian returned to the surface, boarded his jump ship, and accelerated back into orbit, leaving the Hive leadership isolated and physically vulnerable. Immediately following the strike on the moon, the deep space optical arrays intercepted an encrypted physical transmission originating from the heavy, metallic clouds of Venus. The communication carried complex architectural coordinates and raw mathematical data. A Warlock scholar named Ikora Ray analyzed the transmission, recognizing the specific formatting. The data belonged to a human researcher, an awoken woman named Mara Sov, who ruled a massive, decentralized fleet of salvaged Golden Age vessels hiding in the asteroid belt known as the Reef. The transmission detailed the exact physical location of the Black Garden, the vast subterranean Vex network that Kaber's team had failed to completely dismantle. The data indicated that the Vex were actively rebuilding their temporal mechanics around a massive, dark artifact located at the absolute center of the garden. The Vanguard realized the temporal threat remained entirely active. They routed the coordinates directly to the Guardian's jump ship, instructing him to travel to Venus, breach the physical boundary of the Black Garden, and permanently sever the Vex from the dark artifact before they could manipulate the timeline and erase the last city from existence. The Guardian boarded his jump ship and engaged the chemical thrusters, lifting off from the cosmodrome. The vessel accelerated into the dark starfield, maintaining a direct trajectory toward the dense, highly acidic clouds of Venus. The ship broke through the sulfuric atmosphere, scanning the thick jungle canopy below. Following the coordinates provided by the awoken Queen, the Guardian landed his vessel near a massive, naturally formed sinkhole. He descended the steep, rocky walls, dropping onto a wide platform constructed from smooth white stone and thick brass plates. At the end of the platform stood an immense, completely dormant circular ring built from heavy stone blocks. The Guardian gripped his kinetic auto-rifle and approached the structure. A large Vex Minotaur materialized on the platform, its brass chassis fully assembled and its central void cannon charging. The Guardian raised his rifle, firing a sustained burst of heavy rounds directly into the Minotaur's glass abdominal module. The armor shattered, spilling the white radiolarian fluid onto the stone. The Guardian channeled his white paracausal energy into his hand, forcing the energy down into the broken brass chassis. The raw light overloaded the internal circuitry of the machine. The Minotaur detonated violently, releasing a massive surge of temporal energy that struck the dormant stone ring. The central cavity of the structure instantly filled with a swirling, viscous membrane, forming a physical gateway directly into the Vex network. The Guardian stepped through the glowing threshold. He rematerialized inside a sprawling, subterranean environment designated as the Black Garden. The sky above consisted of a solid, low-hanging ceiling of dark, featureless stone. Thick patches of red sand covered the ground, completely saturated with blooming red flowers and dense, overgrown metallic vines. The Guardian walked through the geometric brass corridors, his heavy boots crunching against the dry flora. He located the central chamber of the garden. In the middle of this vast space floated a massive, amorphous mass of dark energy. The object continuously shifted and pulsated, dripping a thick, black fluid onto the stone floor. The Vex frames standing guard around the perimeter exhibited distinct physical modifications. Their brass plating was heavily rusted and completely overgrown with moss, and they stood entirely motionless, their optical sensors dimmed. They were physically kneeling before the dark mass, offering active, mechanical worship to the object. The Guardian raised his kinetic rifle and fired a single round directly into the dark mass. The object violently contracted, emitting a harsh, low-frequency pulse. The dark energy arced outward, striking three massive, inert Minotaur statues positioned around the perimeter of the chamber. The statues animated immediately, their heavy bronze joints grinding together as they stepped down from their pedestals. The Guardian ducked behind a low stone wall as the massive machines fired concentrated, rotating spheres of void energy. The explosions shattered the stone and incinerated the red flowers, filling the air with heavy smoke and falling ash. The Guardian sprinted from his cover, channeling his paracausal energy into his legs to propel his body high into the air. He landed directly on the broad shoulders of the first Minotaur. He drove the barrel of his rifle directly into the optical sensor of the machine, emptying the magazine and completely destroying the internal processor. The massive frame collapsed, crashing heavily onto the stone tiles. The Guardian turned toward the second Minotaur. He summoned a solid, glowing blade of arc electricity into his hand, closing the distance and slicing cleanly through the thick bronze leg joints of the machine. The Minotaur toppled forward, its void cannon misfiring and blasting a crater into the far wall. The Guardian drove the arc blade down into the exposed glass module, neutralizing the second unit. The third Minotaur charged forward, its heavy bronze feet crushing the red flowers. The Guardian stepped backward, raising his hand to project a concentrated blast of pure void radiation. The sphere collided with the Minotaur's chassis, imploding the metal and instantly ripping the physical structure apart at the subatomic level. With the three Guardians of the dark mass completely destroyed, the amorphous object destabilized. The thick, black fluid boiled rapidly, expanding outward until the entire mass violently exploded. The physical detonation sent a massive shockwave across the Black Garden, snapping the metallic vines and reducing the stone pillars to rubble. The dark energy completely evaporated, leaving no physical trace of the artifact. Immediately, the low-hanging ceiling of dark stone fractured. The rock split open, allowing the harsh sunlight and the thick sulfuric clouds of the Venusian atmosphere to pour into the subterranean space. The destruction of the dark artifact physically anchored the Black Garden directly back into the material universe, permanently preventing the Vex from utilizing the object to manipulate the temporal pathways of the Sol system. The Guardian documented the structural collapse, reloaded his weapon, and transmitted the physical confirmation of his success to the Vanguard Operations Hub located on Earth. The destruction of the glowing crystal deep inside the lunar hellmouth severed the direct flow of harvested paracausal energy to Crota. His physical mass depleted rapidly, and his rigid bone armor grew brittle and cracked under the severe metabolic deficit. A specialized team of 6 light-bearers descended into the dark pumice tunnels of his localized throne world on the moon. They bypassed the weakened Hive Guard units and engaged Crota directly. The light-bearers completely overwhelmed the starving prince, severing his physical form and absorbing the remaining energy from his dying worm. The massive iron cleaver fell from his grasp and shattered against the floor. Crota's physical death sent a concentrated, high-frequency biological distress signal out into the deep vacuum of space. The transmission bypassed the inner planets entirely, echoing across the distant star systems and reaching the massive flagship of the Hive Armada. Oryx, the Taken King, stood on the command deck of the dreadnought. He absorbed the distress signal and registered the exact physical coordinates of Crota's death within the Sol system. Oryx gripped his star metal sword and commanded his navigators to alter the trajectory of the entire fleet. The colossal dreadnought and the accompanying jagged bone ships ignited their fusion drives, accelerating into faster-than-light transit and jumping directly into the orbit of Saturn. The awoken queen, Mara Sov, detected the massive displacement of gravity as the Hive fleet arrived. She mobilized her entire reef armada, deploying thousands of sleek, heavily armed fighter interceptors and massive command carriers. The awoken ships formed a solid blockade line across the rings of Saturn, intercepting the advancing bone ships. Mara Sov stood on the bridge of her flagship, raising her hands to channel concentrated spheres of pure energy. The glowing orbs launched into the vacuum, colliding with the smaller Hive vessels and detonating with enough force to shatter their bone hulls and incinerate the Hive soldiers inside. Oryx walked to the edge of the dreadnought's command platform. He raised his heavy star metal sword and drove the blade down into the dark pumice floor. The ship's primary weapon engaged, projecting a massive, expanding dome of inverted white-hot energy outward from the hull. The blast wave rippled across the rings of Saturn, slamming into the awoken fleet. The energy instantly dissolved the titanium hulls of the command carriers, broke the physical bonds of the fighter interceptors, and ripped the awoken pilots from material space. The localized vacuum collapsed, entirely annihilating Mara Sov's armada and leaving only scattered debris floating in the dark. The dreadnought held its position within the rings of Saturn, utilizing the massive debris field as physical cover. Oryx deployed thousands of jagged seed pods toward the inner planets, actively distributing his Taken forces across Earth, Venus, and Mars. The Taken entities materialized from glowing ruptures, appearing as completely black figures with stark white optical sensors. They attacked the fallen syndicates and the Vex networks simultaneously, firing concentrated blasts of dark radiation and violently claiming physical territory. Zavala and the Vanguard commanders monitored the massive influx of Taken forces across the system. They recognized the dreadnought as the central command node for the entire invasion. The Vanguard directed the Guardian to board a heavily modified stealth ship, equipping the vessel with specialized sensor-baffling technology designed by a former warlock named Eris Morn. The Guardian launched from the last city, navigated through the dense debris field of the destroyed Awoken fleet, and manually docked the stealth ship inside a massive, jagged breach in the dreadnought's hull. The Guardian disembarked onto the dark pumice decks of the Hive flagship. He moved through the endless corridors of calcified bone, encountering heavy resistance from the Ascendant Knights and specialized Taken units. He fired concentrated bursts from his kinetic weapons, physically pushing through the heavily armored infantry. He reached the central chamber of the ship, a vast open space containing a dark, swirling tier in the physical fabric of the universe. Oryx stepped through the rupture, his massive, heavily armored frame towering over the Guardian. Oryx raised his star metal sword, swinging the heavy blade down in wide, crushing arcs. The Guardian dodged the massive weapon, firing high-yield rockets directly into Oryx's chest armor. The explosions cracked the dense chitin, exposing the raw, pulsing muscle tissue underneath. The Guardian channeled a concentrated blast of bright paracausal energy into his hands, focusing the light into a solid, geometric hammer. He leaped onto a protruding bone column, pushing off the structure and driving the glowing hammer straight down into Oryx's exposed chest cavity. The concentrated light overloaded the dark energy sustaining the king's physical form. Oryx's biological tissue rapidly dissolved, his bone plates disintegrating into a cloud of black ash. The king's body completely vanished, his consciousness retreating back through the central rupture into the deepest layer of his ascendant throne world. The Vanguard recorded the physical defeat of Oryx in the material universe, but Eris Morn confirmed the king remained active within his pocket dimension. To permanently eliminate the threat of the Taken army, the Vanguard deployed a specialized six-man strike team. The Guardian led the team through the swirling dimensional tear, stepping onto the floating slabs of dark stone. They navigated the complex paracausal mechanics of the dimension, systematically killing the high-ranking Ascendant Hive and funneling the released energy directly back at Oryx. The concentrated blasts of corrupted light completely destabilized the king's enormous dimensional form. Oryx's massive body crystallized, turning entirely into rigid, brittle stone. The stone shattered, and his petrified corpse drifted out into the vacuum of space, falling silently toward the gaseous storms of Saturn. During the Vanguard assault on the Dreadnought, a specialized division of heavily armored, bipedal military units, designated as the Cabal, breached the bone hull of the Hive flagship. The Cabal soldiers possessed immense physical mass, thick gray skin, and pressurized combat suits designed to simulate the heavy gravity of their homeworld. They set up a physical transmission array on the dark pumice floor of the Dreadnought and directed a high-frequency radio signal out into the deep starfield. The transmission carried detailed optical recordings of the light-bearers utilizing paracausal energy, along with the precise planetary coordinates of the white sphere resting over Earth. The signal traveled across the galaxy and reached the Central Command flagship of the Cabal Empire, a colossal vessel constructed from overlapping red steel plates and heavy industrial exhaust vents. The military dictator of the Empire, Dominus Gaul, received the transmission and observed the physical capabilities of the white sphere on his optical monitors. Gaul possessed a massive, heavily scarred physical frame encased in thick, white and gold ceramic armor. He mobilized his elite military armada, known as the Red Legion, and commanded the fleet to navigate toward the Sol system to physically extract the white sphere and claim the paracausal radiation for his own army. The massive Red Legion armada dropped out of faster-than-light transit directly above Earth's atmosphere. A dense, high-precipitation storm completely obscured their thermal and gravitational signatures, allowing the heavy red warships to bypass the Vanguard's orbital deep space sensors. The Cabal ships descended through the thick clouds and immediately initiated a concentrated orbital bombardment on the last city. High-yield explosive missiles struck the tower, shattering the concrete battlements and collapsing the primary steel landing pads. The kinetic force of the blasts threw the light-bearers across the courtyards, burying their weapons and automated defense turrets beneath thousands of tons of pulverized rubble. The Cabal transport vessels hovered over the destroyed plazas and deployed heavy iron boarding ramps. Thousands of Red Legion infantry marched down the ramps, firing concentrated slugs of superheated micro-missiles from their heavy assault rifles. Zavala and Ikora Ray stood in the central courtyard, generating solid walls of hard light and hurling spheres of void radiation into the advancing troops. The paracausal energy melted the Cabal's pressurized suits and boiled their internal fluids, leaving deep craters in the stone floor. The Guardian joined the Vanguard commanders, firing high-velocity kinetic rounds through the thick helmets of the Cabal soldiers and physically halting their advance toward the civilian evacuation shuttles. Dominus Gaul piloted his central command ship directly over the last city, steering the colossal red hull completely past the ground combat and positioning it adjacent to the white sphere. The command ship deployed a massive, mechanical cage constructed from thousands of interlocking titanium struts and heavy magnetic clamps. The cage expanded outward, wrapping its metal arms entirely around the circumference of the sphere. The magnetic clamps snapped into place, locking the structure tightly against the pale metal. The cage engaged its primary suppression mechanisms, generating a solid, high-frequency energy field that completely enveloped the sphere and severed the emission of the white paracausal radiation. The sudden termination of the white energy triggered an immediate physical reaction across the entire light-bearer population. Zavala's hard light shields instantly dissolved into the surrounding air. Ikora's glowing void spheres evaporated into loose vapor. The Guardian's arc blade shattered into scattered sparks. The heavy armor plates suddenly transferred their absolute physical weight to the light-bearers, pulling them down onto the cracked concrete. The Cabal infantry surged forward, swinging heavy metallic blades and driving their armored boots into the exposed Vanguard commanders. Gaul stepped onto the deck of his command ship, grabbed the Guardian by the throat, and kicked the light-bearer directly off the edge of the vessel. The Guardian plummeted thousands of feet through the air, crashing heavily into the twisted steel rebar and shattered glass of the ruined streets below. The Guardian survived the extreme physical impact, suffering fractured skeletal structures and multiple ruptured internal organs. They dragged their broken body through the debris, moving past the burning rubble of the city walls and crawling into the dense, overgrown vegetation of the European dead zone. They navigated the muddy trenches and thick roots for several days until they reached a deep, cratered valley. At the center of the valley rested a massive, jagged shard of pale metal, covered in thick moss and glowing with a faint internal light. This shard had sheared off from the white sphere centuries prior, during the initial blast wave that pushed the dark pyramids away from Earth. The Guardian reached out and pressed their blood-stained hand directly against the surface of the pale shard. The residual white energy stored inside the metal flowed directly into their biological tissue. The paracausal radiation rapidly mended their fractured bones, sealed their ruptured organs, and reignited the mechanical core of their damaged ghost. The Guardian stood up, fully healed, and manifested a solid sphere of thermal solar energy in their palm. They gripped a salvaged kinetic rifle, gathered a small militia of surviving human colonists from the surrounding forest, and charted the exact orbital trajectory required to launch a direct physical assault on Gaul's flagship and violently dismantle the mechanical cage. The Guardian secured the flight coordinates from their ghost and navigated a salvaged jump ship through the heavy storm clouds over Earth. The dense precipitation masked their thermal signature from the Red Legion interceptors patrolling the upper atmosphere. The Guardian broke through the cloud cover and saw Dominus Gaul's colossal flagship positioned directly adjacent to the white sphere. The massive mechanical cage completely enclosed the sphere, maintaining the solid energy field that suppressed the paracausal radiation. The Guardians steered their ship toward the flagship, ignoring the automated docking protocols, and rammed the nose of their vessel directly through the thick steel viewport of the primary command bridge. The heavy glass shattered, rapidly depressurizing the immediate deck. The Guardian unbuckled their harness and stepped out of the crashed ship onto the red metal floor plates. They immediately channeled the white energy stored in their biological tissue, forming a solid kinetic shield around their body. The Red Legion guards inside the bridge raised their heavy assault rifles and fired concentrated micro-missiles. The explosives detonated against the shield, filling the room with thick smoke and shrapnel. The Guardian pushed through the crossfire, firing high-velocity kinetic rounds from their auto-rifle and piercing the thick ceramic armor of the Cabal soldiers. They cleared the bridge, moved to the central command console, and initiated a physical override of the ship's navigation systems, attempting to crash the colossal vessel and shatter the mechanical cage. Dominus Gaul stepped onto the command deck from a set of heavy blast doors. The massive Cabal dictator wore his white and gold armor, now visibly altered by heavy modifications. Thick, transparent tubes ran from an external containment unit on his back, directly into his neck and spinal column. The fluid inside the tubes glowed with a bright, unstable white light. Gaul had manually extracted raw paracausal energy from the caged sphere and pumped the radiation directly into his own biological system. Gaul raised his massive fist and projected a concentrated sphere of thermal solar energy. The blast struck the Guardian's shield, instantly overloading the kinetic barrier and throwing them backward across the metal deck. The Guardian hit the steel bulkhead and dropped their rifle. Gaul advanced, channeling the white energy into his boots and launching his massive frame into the air. He crashed down, crushing the metal floor plates beneath his weight, and swung a solid, geometric blade of void radiation. The Guardian rolled aside, narrowly avoiding the blade, and retaliated by generating a crackling staff of arc electricity. They struck Gaul across his heavy chest armor. The arc energy severed the thick, transparent tubes connected to his spine. The pressurized white fluid sprayed across the room, violently burning the steel walls. Gaul staggered, his stolen paracausal energy rapidly fluctuating. The Guardian closed the distance, channeling their remaining light into a concentrated kinetic impact, and drove their fist directly into Gaul's exposed facial plate. The physical force shattered his respiratory mask and crushed his skull. Gaul's massive body collapsed onto the deck. The unstable white energy remaining in his tissues rapidly expanded, consuming his physical form and converting his biological mass into a towering, semi-translucent projection of pure light. This massive energy construct hovered over the flagship, emitting a blinding glare across the ruined Last City. The construct reached its massive hands toward the white sphere, attempting to physically merge with the source of the paracausal power. The white sphere reacted instantly. The jagged fissures on its lower hemisphere expanded, cracking the pale metal further. The sphere expelled a concentrated, omnidirectional blast of raw energy. The kinetic force of the blast struck the massive mechanical cage, snapping the thick titanium struts and completely shattering the heavy magnetic clamps. The cage disintegrated into thousands of twisted metal fragments, scattering into the atmosphere. The sphere's energy wave continued outward, colliding with Gaul's towering construct. The intense radiation instantly dissolved the stolen light, entirely erasing Gaul's physical and energetic existence from the material universe. The blast wave rippled across the inner system, washing over the remaining Red Legion armada and permanently disabling their deep space propulsion engines. The Guardian stood on the ruined command deck and watched the white sphere completely free of the mechanical cage. The sphere hovered silently, no longer emitting the bright, localized energy pulses. The cracks on its surface remained open, exposing the glowing white interior to the vacuum. The Guardian's ghost materialized, scanning the surrounding atmosphere. The ghost confirmed the immediate physical return of the paracausal radiation. In the ruins of the last city below, Zavala, Ikora Ray, and the surviving light-bearers felt the energy re-enter their biological systems. They materialized their kinetic shields and void spheres, actively pushing the stranded Cabal infantry out of the city perimeters and reclaiming the pouring concrete of the central tower. The Vanguard officially documented the end of the Red War, organizing massive labor forces to extract the broken steel beams and rebuild the ruined plazas. However, the deep space optical arrays tracking the sphere's final energy blast registered a secondary event. The massive wave of bright light had traveled far beyond the Sol system, crossing the entire galaxy and striking the cold vacuum of deep space. Out in the dark starfield, the blast wave washed over the dormant fleet of Black Pyramid ships. The dark tetrahedrons, completely stationary since the end of the collapse, registered the energetic signature. The Witness stood on the command deck of the primary flagship and observed the exact coordinates of the blast. The Pyramid fleet instantly engaged their massive propulsion drives, altering their trajectory and accelerating directly toward the localized position of the newly awakened white sphere. The Black Pyramid fleet traversed the physical space between the outer galaxies and the Sol system. They moved rapidly past the heliopause, breaking through the outer gravitational boundaries and decelerating precisely above the frozen, terrestrial crusts of the peripheral planets and moons. The ships positioned themselves in low orbit over Titan, Io, Mars, and Mercury. The Vanguard optical arrays detected the immense thermal and gravitational signatures. The tetrahedrons deployed massive, concentrated waves of dark energy directly onto the planetary surfaces. On Titan, the dark energy struck the liquid methane ocean, instantly altering the molecular density of the fluid. The methane hardened into solid, jagged spikes, crushing the remaining steel arcologies and permanently freezing the submerged human habitats. On Io, the energy waves burrowed into the sulfur bedrock, violently extracting the fossilized ammonite structures and pulling the raw calcium directly into the lower holds of the pyramid ships. On Mars, the sandstorms halted completely. The dark radiation compressed the red dust into a smooth, featureless shell of black glass, entirely encasing the Clovis Bray industrial complexes and burying Rasputin's physical servers beneath an impenetrable layer of hardened slag. Mercury suffered a total atmospheric collapse, the intense heat of the sun blocked by the massive triangular shadows cast by the fleet. The Vanguard mobilized their entire defensive armada. Hundreds of jump ships and heavily armored cruisers launched from the last city, breaking Earth's atmosphere and accelerating toward the occupied planets. The light-bearers fired high-yield kinetic payloads and concentrated solar lasers directly at the black hulls of the pyramids. The munitions struck the ships, but the dark energy absorbed the kinetic force and dissipated the thermal radiation instantly, leaving the tetrahedrons entirely undamaged. The ships did not return fire. They simply held their positions, continuing to project their suppressing radiation down onto the planets. Zavala stood on the concrete battlements of the tower, monitoring the telemetry from the strike teams. The physical data indicated the pyramids were utilizing the dark energy to completely isolate the targeted planets from the rest of the physical universe. The gravitational fields around Titan, Io, Mars, and Mercury warped heavily, bending the visible light around the planets. Within hours, the four celestial bodies vanished from the optical arrays completely. They left no physical trace, no thermal exhaust, and no gravitational pull. The pyramids effectively deleted the planets from material space, cutting off millions of light-bearers and human colonists trapped on the surfaces. Following the disappearance of the planets, the witness transmitted a localized audio frequency directly into the auditory sensors of the Vanguard communication relays. The transmission bypassed standard encryption, playing a low, steady voice through the speakers of the tower. The witness stated that the white sphere offered only uncontrolled, painful biological mutation. The dark energy, however, provided absolute, eternal structural salvation. The witness directed the light-bearers to travel to the frozen Jovian moon of Europa to physically observe the true nature of this salvation. The Vanguard dispatched the Guardian to Europa to investigate the transmission. The Guardian boarded their jump ship, navigated the asteroid belt, and landed on the thick, shifting ice sheets of the moon. They marched through the freezing blizzards, gripping their kinetic rifle to steady themselves against the high-velocity winds. They crested a steep, frozen ridge and observed a massive, black pyramid ship hovering directly over a ruined, snow-covered Golden Age colony. Beneath the pyramid, the fallen syndicates had established a sprawling encampment of salvaged iron and canvas tents. The Guardian deployed their optical binoculars, zooming in on the fallen infantry. The fallen soldiers were not utilizing their standard plasma rifles or arc blades. They wielded thick, angular shards of dark, jagged ice. The Guardian observed a fallen captain raise his hand, channel concentrated dark energy from the pyramid ship, and rapidly freeze the surrounding atmospheric moisture into solid, geometric barricades. The dark energy physically manifested as extreme cold, halting atomic vibration, and instantly lowering the localized temperature to absolute zero. The Vanguard scholars later designated this new physical element as stasis. The Fallen utilized stasis to build their fortifications and physically freeze opposing light-bearer scouts in their tracks. The dark energy bypassed the white light shields entirely, penetrating the armor joints and freezing the biological tissue solid. The Guardian moved closer to the encampment, dropping into the snow and engaging the fallen infantry. A captain launched a heavy spear of stasis directly at the Guardian. The spear struck the Guardian's kinetic shield, shattering the hard light and immediately encasing their left arm in a thick block of dark ice. The extreme cold stopped the blood flow and ruptured the muscle fibers. The Guardian fell back into the snow, their auto rifle dropping from their frozen hand. The pyramid ship hovering above projected a thin, concentrated beam of dark energy directly onto the Guardian's chest armor. The energy bypassed their ghost entirely, flowing straight into the Guardian's biological tissue. The Guardian felt the raw, subatomic structure of the stasis element mapping itself onto their nervous system. They reached out with their unfrozen right hand, channeled the dark energy, and manifested a solid staff of jagged ice. They swung the stasis staff, shattering the ice block on their left arm, and charged the fallen captain, driving the dark weapon directly through his chest plate and freezing his internal organs solid. The Guardian had officially wielded the dark energy of the Witness. The vanguard commanders stood on the reconstructed concrete battlements of the tower and observed the dark pyramid ships holding their stationary positions over the frozen inner planets. The physical threat of the Witness loomed heavily over the system, yet the Armada made no immediate physical advance toward Earth. The Warlock commander, Ikora Rey, utilized her intelligence network, the Hidden, to intercept fragmented audio transmissions and scattered data packets originating from the deep space communication arrays on Neptune. The data revealed a hidden, highly advanced human colony located within the dense, high-pressure atmosphere of the gas giant, totally intact and operating a massive metropolis completely unrecorded by the Vanguard. Ikora routed the intercepted coordinates directly to the Guardian's jump ship. She noted that the transmission contained specific references to the Veil, the ancient organic structure that the Penitent had dragged across the universe to create the Witness. The Vanguard concluded that the Witness had halted its immediate physical assault on Earth to deploy forces to Neptune and secure the Veil before moving against the White Sphere. The Guardian engaged the chemical thrusters, launching from the last city and accelerating out into the dark vacuum, charting a direct course for the gas giant. The jump ship bypassed the asteroid belt and entered the dense upper atmosphere of Neptune. The thick, swirling clouds of hydrogen and helium parted, revealing a sprawling, brightly lit city constructed from smooth, iridescent metals and thick, reinforced glass. The metropolis, designated Neomuna, floated entirely on repulsor arrays within the crushing atmospheric pressure. The Guardian landed their vessel on a wide, empty landing pad and gripped their heavy kinetic auto rifle. They moved through the empty, pristine streets, noting the complete lack of physical inhabitants. The citizens of Neomuna had transferred their biological consciousnesses into a massive digital network, leaving the physical city entirely deserted. The Guardian tracked a massive thermal signature moving toward the lower levels of the city. They descended through the metal corridors, reaching a vast subterranean containment facility. At the center of the facility sat the Veil. The enormous organic web pulsed with deep purple and bright blue light, illuminating the dark chamber. Thick, bioluminescent roots spread across the metal floor plates, and the central canopy hummed with a low, continuous electrical current. The Guardian raised their weapon, preparing to defend the structure, but a massive physical entity materialized directly in front of the Veil, stepping through a swirling, green portal. The entity stood over 10 feet tall, possessing a heavily armored, bipedal frame. He wore dark, geometric plating and carried a long, double-bladed glaive, emitting a crackling green energy. The Vanguard database identified this figure as Callus, the former emperor of the Cabal, now heavily mutated and elevated to the rank of disciple by the Witness. Callus had utilized his remaining Red Legion forces and the dark energy granted by his new master to infiltrate Neomuna and physically link the Veil to the communication relay on his command ship. Callus swung his massive green glaive in a wide arc, unleashing a torrent of destructive energy that shattered the reinforced glass observation decks overlooking the chamber. The Guardian engaged, firing high-velocity kinetic rounds directly into the disciples' dark armor. The projectiles sparked and ricocheted off the dense metal. The Guardian channeled the white paracausal light into their hands, forming a solid kinetic shield, and charged forward. Callus slammed the heavy butt of his glaive into the metal floor, generating a localized shockwave that threw the Guardian backward. The Guardian hit the wall, recovering quickly and materializing a glowing staff of arc electricity. They sprinted toward Callus, sliding under another wide swing of the glaive, and drove the electrified staff directly into the unarmored joints of the disciple's knee. The arc energy severed the thick muscle fibers and overloaded the internal cybernetics. Callus roared, dropping to one knee, and fired a concentrated blast from his glaive. The Guardian projected a spherical void shield, absorbing the impact, and quickly transitioned to their newly acquired stasis energy. They channeled the absolute cold, manifesting a heavy, jagged spear of dark ice. The Guardian lunged forward, driving the stasis spear directly through the center of Callus's chest plate. The extreme cold instantly froze the disciple's internal organs and halted the flow of the dark energy, sustaining his massive frame. Callus's physical body locked entirely solid, turning into a rigid statue of dark ice. The Guardians stepped back and fired a single kinetic round from their auto-rifle into the frozen chest. The dense armor shattered, reducing the disciple to a pile of scattered, frozen debris on the metal floor. The Guardians secured the perimeter around the veil and transmitted the physical confirmation of Callus's defeat back to the vanguard. However, the Guardian's ghost suddenly elevated from their hand, drifting helplessly toward the pulsing, bioluminescent canopy of the massive organic structure. The ghost's central optical lens flickered, transitioning from a bright blue to a completely dark, light-absorbing black. The physical casing of the small machine expanded and contracted erratically. A low, overlapping chorus of voices transmitted directly through the ghost's audio speakers, echoing across the metal containment chamber. The witness had utilized the raw paracausal energy of the Guardian's ghost to establish a direct, physical link with the veil. The electrical current in the organic structure surged, sending a massive, concentrated beam of dark energy straight up through the atmosphere of Neptune and out into the vacuum of space. The beam arced across the solar system, striking the white sphere hovering directly over the last city on Earth. The dark energy collided with the pale metal, tearing a massive, jagged, triangular portal directly into the surface of the sphere. The witness immediately commanded the Black Pyramid fleet to break their orbit over the frozen planets and accelerate straight toward Earth. The massive tetrahedrons flew directly through the glowing triangular portal, physically entering the white sphere and disappearing from the material universe entirely. The Black Pyramid ships vanished through the jagged triangular portal, leaving the white sphere hovering completely silent above the last city. The Guardian launched their jump ship, adjusting their flight path to match the exact coordinates of the portal. They flew the vessel directly into the glowing rupture on the surface of the sphere, breaking the exterior hull and crossing the physical threshold. The ship materialized inside a vast internal dimension. This space contained sprawling, overgrown landscapes comprised entirely of pale, smooth stone and glowing geometric flora. The Guardian exited their ship, gripping their kinetic rifle, and observed the environment. The internal dimension reacted directly to their physical presence, shifting the pale stone to recreate distinct locations from the Guardian's past. The terrain formed a pristine, uncorrupted replica of the original Cosmodrome wall, followed by a towering, white stone reconstruction of the central tower. The Vanguard designated this interior, reactive space as the Pale Heart. The Guardian advanced through the reconstructed environments, tracking the massive, dark energy signature of the witness. The terrain grew progressively distorted closer to the center of the Pale Heart. The pristine white stone fractured into jagged, black obsidian. The glowing flora withered, replaced by calcified, petrified wood and pools of thick, dark fluid. The witness had already established a physical foothold near the core, utilizing the dark energy of the veil to overwrite the white radiation. The Guardian pushed through the corrupted terrain, engaging hordes of taken infantry and massive, heavily armored tormentor units deployed to guard the central perimeter. The Guardian reached a massive, open plateau, composed entirely of completely smooth, black glass. At the far end of the plateau hovered the Witness. The colossal entity possessed its tall, dark metallic robe, with the continuous plume of pale, semi-translucent faces billowing upward from the crown of its head. The Witness raised its pale hands, channeling concentrated waves of dark energy intended to lock the entire physical structure of the Pale Heart into a permanent, unchanging state. The Guardian sprinted across the black glass, firing high-yield kinetic rounds directly at the entity. The Witness rotated its hands, projecting a solid, geometric shield of dark energy that effortlessly absorbed the kinetic impact. The entity then retaliated, firing a dense, highly concentrated beam of pure stasis radiation. The dark energy struck the Guardian, instantly freezing their kinetic shield and encasing their armor in thick, jagged ice. The extreme cold penetrated their physical tissue, severely dropping their core temperature. The Guardian pushed back against the cold, channeling a sudden, massive surge of white paracausal energy. They manifested a heavy, glowing maul of thermal solar energy, swinging the weapon and completely shattering the stasis block. The Guardian closed the distance, transitioning their energy into the dark, vibrating frequencies of strand. They projected thick, green tethers of the paracausal energy, wrapping the cords around the Witness's arms and physically restricting the entity's movements. The Guardian leaped into the air, drawing a heavy sword forged entirely from void radiation. They drove the blade straight down into the chest of the Witness. The void energy violently clashed with the concentrated darkness sustaining the entity. The physical form of the Witness destabilized heavily, the dark metallic robe fraying at the edges, but the entity quickly generated a massive, omnidirectional shockwave. The blast threw the Guardian backward, sending them crashing onto the black glass. The Guardian recovered their footing and observed the massive plume of faces rising from the Witness. The Guardian realized that the entity was not a single, cohesive organism, but a unified physical structure containing millions of distinct, individual consciousnesses. To permanently destroy the entity, the Guardian needed to dismantle this internal collective. The Guardian charged their kinetic auto-rifle with the pure, white energy radiating from the surrounding uncorrupted sections of the Pale Heart. They aimed their weapon directly at the billowing plume of pale faces and pulled the trigger. The concentrated, paracausally charged rounds struck the plume. The white energy violently disrupted the dark binding radiation of the veil. The individual faces in the smoke began to scream, their digital and biological patterns tearing apart under the impact. The Guardian fired continuously, unloading magazine after magazine into the plume. The physical structure of the Witness shuddered violently as the internal collective collapsed. The pale faces disintegrated entirely, dissolving into loose, scattered ash. The dark metallic robe lost its rigid form, melting into a thick, black fluid that spilled across the glass plateau. The central consciousness of the Witness permanently ceased all electrical and paracausal functions. The Guardian lowered their weapon, watching the last remnants of the black fluid evaporate into the atmosphere of the Pale Heart. The jagged obsidian terrain immediately began to recede, the dark stone smoothing back into pristine, white architecture. The Guardian's ghost materialized, scanning the environment and confirming the complete eradication of the dark energy signature. The Guardian boarded their jump ship and navigated back through the triangular portal, returning to the material universe. They steered the vessel down through Earth's atmosphere, landing on the heavily reinforced concrete pads of the last city, as the white sphere held its position above, entirely free of the dark corruption. The long war between the original forces of the Garden had finally reached a physical conclusion, leaving the surviving humans, Awoken, and Exos to rebuild their concrete walls and chart new trajectories across the silent, expanding star systems.